So I failed my own test. The microphone was off. Let me start again for the benefit of everybody. Welcome to colleagues around the board table, and welcome to everybody joining us on the live stream or by later recording. This is to the public board meeting of the Care Quality Commission on 27th of September, Wednesday the 27th of September. So we have a number of things on the agenda to cover this afternoon. We'll try to keep moving reasonably quickly. I'd like just to mention or clarify one or two changes or apologies. Sean O'Kelly is unable to be with us due to a minor operation, but we're delighted to welcome Nicola Wise, who's Head of Inspections, and we're deputised for Sean today. As you regular listeners will know, or watchers will know, we always have a representative from our Qualities Network, representative from that group. So today we welcome Drew Noble from the LGBTQ+. I don't think I have any other administrative arrangements to mention. So just as a final administrative point, are there any new conflicts of interest to declare? Okay. And anything else people want to put on the agenda, urgent business, not otherwise on the agenda? No. Okay. So let's move straight away to a really very important topic, which is the update on the listening, learning and responding concerns review. As my board colleagues know, and anybody watching in, we spent some time on a couple of sessions earlier this year considering the outputs from the reports that were done and were presented by those responsible, and we pulled together an analysis of the actions that would be required by management to respond. So with the overwhelming theme that the recommendations are accepted, but we needed a little bit more granularity so that could be tracked. So I think we're going to be Kate Taroni and Kate Staples presenting. So Kate, over to you.
Thank you. So we're almost 6 months since the publication of the Listening, Learning and Responding to Concerns review, and this is our first opportunity to come back together as a group in public to update you all on progress against the significant number of recommendations that were in the LLRC, which is how we describe Listening, Learning, Responding to Concerns review in a way that's slightly easier to articulate. So the paper in front of you shows the work that Kate's been leading along with other directors and colleagues in the organisation. It reflects areas where we've made good progress, and it reflects areas where there is more work to do. You'll note that there has been a huge amount of activity, but we are really keen as an organisation that, as well as ticking things off the list that we've done the required actions, that we're also measuring and evaluating impact on kind of changes in culture as well. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Kate to bring to life highlights from the paper.
Thank you, Kate. It bears repeating that the LLRC was a watershed moment for CQC. It was an opportunity for a long, hard look at the way we do things, the way we did things, and more importantly, it was an opportunity for colleagues around this table to pause for thought and really commit to doing something to effect sustainable change. Those of you who are familiar with the detail of the recommendations will know that some are deeply practical, mechanistic things, relatively easy to achieve in a short time frame. Others are much more far-reaching and will require sustained effort over months and years actually to get lodged and become part of the DNA of the organisation. The progress chart you can see at the last page of the report gives you a sense of where we now are, and in putting that chart together we have been careful to be honest, and I just want to sort of dwell a little bit on a point that Kate made in her brief introduction about monitoring progress and making sure that things are actually being delivered and being done. In the period since the paper was submitted, that's a group of us being led principally by Steph Tarrant and the performance team, who's done a fantastic job, have been thinking about how to hold ourselves to account for delivery. And the way we propose to do that going forward is to ensure that each of the recommendations is mapped to one of our ET subcommittees, which will own the responsibility of receiving regular updates on progress, but critically, where it is said that an action has been completed and an impact has been delivered, we will want evidence to be provided to that committee so that we can say, yes, we agree some sustainable and meaningful change has been delivered. So we're going to start rolling that out in the next few weeks. And I think we're next due at board in November, so we should be able to give you an insight into how that's going. I also want to just highlight the measure cut twice and cut once phrase that's in the paper. And I want to highlight that because given the importance and given the very resonant subject matter of some of the recommendations, particularly those about our racial fluency and about reasonable adjustments for colleagues who need them, it's tempting to want to rush to action and get something in place quickly. But the measure twice and cut once approach is specifically focused on making sure that when we act, we know that we are choosing the right course of action and something that will stick. So in terms of racial fluency, for example, Tyson has done some wonderful work over the summer, and I have to sort of name check Blessing Hale as well from the network in thinking long and hard about what sort of training and frankly challenge we need around this table to look again at how we think about these things, and that has yielded a really good design for a session that's going to be delivered, I think, on the 19th of October at SLT 30. So it's taken a bit of time to get there, but what's being promised and what hopefully will come out of that session is going to be all the more impactful as a consequence. And similarly, on some of the more external facing elements, work streams 1 and 5, which relate to whistleblowing from the sectors and information coming into the organisation from outside. I'm going to name check another group of people. That's Hayley Moore, Jill Morell, Helen Lowrens and Tracy Forrester. All of them, in addition to busy portfolios of responsibility, have set aside time to think about ways of bringing to life those work streams. Some incremental improvements are already evident, and there is a good flight path leading forward that will yield benefits. So there's been a great slew of activity. Much of it won't have been visible to many colleagues across the organisation, but it is being done, and happy to take questions.
So, questions for the Kates, anybody? Yes, Stephen.
Kate, firstly, thank you. I think it's really important and really helpful to have this sort of regular progress report. As you said in your comments, I mean, this was a really important report for the board, for the whole organisation, and so it's critical that we do follow it up carefully, methodically, and with real impact. So a big thank you to you for all of that. The other comment was just to sort of make the read across to the work that Kate Rennie is leading on culture change, because there were some very specific recommendations in LLRC, but there were also some quite general findings and conclusions about broader culture. So kind of I think the work programme is not sort of unique and exclusive to LLRC. There are some really important broader developments going on around culture change and what it needs to mean for the organisation that I think will also deliver some of these recommendations as well. So we'll need to sort of keep in touch with that as we go through. Thank you.
I mean, if I may, Ian,
Yeah.
I mean, you're right that the approach we took to implementing LLRC recommendations was not to make them something other, because that's the fastest way for them not to be effective, but to make them part and parcel of what we do. on a daily basis. So that has been happening, certainly in relation to, for example, racial fluency, where Nadia Rahman has been part of a little working group that we've set up to make sure that all of the aspects of that work are moving forward in tandem and all pointing in the same direction. And similarly with culture, the things that are emerging in conversations about the way things are around here are feeding into the work that Kate is leading on culture and the nascent culture plan that Jackie Jackson has been preparing.
Mark.
So again, thank you. Really valuable to sort of see the progress. Probably there would be two challenges that organisations face when they're trying to make this degree of change. The first one is the gap between intent and action, and this really addresses that. There's real action following the intent to sort of make that change. The second one is actually persistence. The only concern that I would have about this being an action-based approach is that when the actions are done doesn't mean the work is done. Right? That's nearly the beginning of the journey, not the end of it. Could you say a little bit more about how, other than just sort of reporting that a change has been made and impact's been had, but how do we make sure that this then becomes that natural way of working and doesn't snap back to older, more established, deeper behaviours?
That's a very good question. I think to some extent you can hardwire some of it in processes, provided the processes align with human nature. The more the process and human nature are at odds, the less likely the process is to stick. But I think it picks up a conversation that we were having this morning about the extent to which we as individuals, particularly around this table, but also across the organisation, take the time to reflect, and take the time to reflect particularly on what it is we need to do and what it is we need to stop doing to make sure that things do change. So it is both an organisational change in terms of systems and processes, but it is a collective and individual moment for reflection on responsibility to behave as we ought to behave.
Other Kate, do you want to comment?
Just one thing to add, if I may, and Joyce might want to come in on this as well. So obviously our commitment wasn't just that we self-report on how we're doing, but that we have a proper evaluation around impact, and that impact being embedded, and that evaluation is happening now, and it will come to a future board as well. Some of the evaluations sitting in a team that reports to Joyce, and we're having ongoing conversations with colleagues who helped us with the original report for that kind of external challenge as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, the evaluation looks at not just the data that you see in front of you, which is how we're delivering against those actions, but if they are embedded, what are the impact they have. There's also the independent oversight built in as part of that evaluation, so we have the people who were involved in the original report coming back and helping us say, well, are we actually making a difference? Because you're absolutely right, we could do so many actions, but it actually doesn't make a difference on the ground, so it's important that we look at that as well.
Ali and then Mark.
Thank you. It's really good to see the progress that we're making on this, and I thank you and the team for your work and for the clarity and candour that have been shared about how progress is continuing. It's also really positive and reassuring to hear that the focus is on making sure things are done well and they embed. I'm interested to understand, I suppose, over the next 6 months or so, whether you see focus being equally spread across all of the different streams of what we're looking at, or whether there are particular areas where there'd be more attention given to.
I think we will need to be much more acute in prioritising, because we know that we've got an awful lot on. Transformation continues. Colleagues in operations groups will be changing the ways they work in the coming weeks and months. So we need to be both realistic and ambitious, and I think we need to be intentional about which areas we focus on to achieve progress, making sure that we always do make progress and don't allow ourselves to sort of come to a standstill. And it will be a combination of importance and capacity and capability at any given moment. and the paper refers to a relatively extended time period for rolling out elements of training on racial fluency, precisely to accommodate the need to do it properly across the whole of the organisation and take into account other aspects of activity.
I think Mark's next, then you, Belinda.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to see this reporting. I'm very encouraged by the candour of the chart on page 4. I think it's great to see that and have the confidence to show where we are still quite away from the target and where we're struggling to start the process of improvement. I think that's not surprising with such a range of recommendations, but it's really helpful to see this, and it'll be helpful to continue to see this. What's particularly encouraging, of course, is that there's been very good progress on learning, and there's been very good progress on listening, and there's more green there than in the other columns, and that's a large part of what this whole exercise was about. Having said that, there's quite a lot of red still on there, where we know it's going to take longer and it's going to be harder. I think one of the challenges of aggregating 84 recommendations and reporting it in this format is that we lose a little bit of the colour about, well, what's in the red. So I think you're going to have to find a way of helping us to understand where really important things that we're struggling to get traction or find a solution for, where those are. I'm looking at freedom to speak up, for example, where it's pretty easy to make rapid progress on the low-hanging fruit, but actually really making developing a true speak-up culture. There's a lot of heavy lifting late on in the game in relation to that, and we don't want to end up with some red at the end of the day in relation to this. If we can start to help with that process, that would be really good. And then my question was, how are we communicating this internally? Because I suspect some of our colleagues internally will be seeing the same challenge of saying, well, what's in the red, what's in the green?
We have been designing an approach that tries to take it thematically and deal with areas such that they get the attention they deserve. So freedom to speak up is one that's getting a lot of focus, and it was a focus of the Let's Talk conversation that Ian led last week. Next month we'll be focusing on racial fluency because it's Black History Month partly, but also because there are lots of things coming on stream. So that we're doing it thematically, and one of the things I have committed to is, after this conversation today at board, is to write a short article so that colleagues who aren't watching today will know that we talked about it. We had a serious conversation. We'll hear what the board wants us to do, and we'll also have an up-to-date version of where we are and an honest assessment of the work we still have to do.
Linda?
Thanks. I just wonder if you could explain the scoring to me, Kate, because I don't really fully understand how moderate distance to target, far from how did you, arrive at those?
They are. It's not algorithmic. It is a judgment. It's a judgment made by the action owner in the first instance, tested occasionally to destruction by the performance management team led by Steph, and it's trying to get a sense of, are we a couple of days away from completing it, or is it months away? And it is a bit subjective, but it is designed to be subjective with a bit of challenge.
Go ahead, couple.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Kate. I appreciate it. In my view, organisational cultural changes much more about how we do things rather than just what we do or what we don't do, which is what you referred to. And I'd like to see that aspect of how we do things incorporated really quickly into our behaviours. I don't see the need to wait for a long time for that, or to carry out a subsequent analysis or whatever. So I would just put that before you, that is more important than, if you like, just the transactional aspects. It is partly about ways of working, but it is not just the technocratic parts of ways of working, it is the emotional part and the engagement with people. So I suppose I'm asking for your assurance that that could be addressed perhaps rather more quickly than you were suggesting in your presentation.
Kate, shall I? You're right, if I go first, and then can I hand to Mark, who might want to talk about Speak Up. Thank you, David, for the question. So Kate talked about this work plugging into the wider piece we're doing at the moment around culture, where we want to look at kind of all aspects of how we work as an organisation. Our values, our behaviours associated with those values, and how we kind of plug expectations in at all points in the way that we work together. So that is activity that's underway at the moment, but will take place in the next couple of months. So this isn't a long piece of work. This is a piece of work that's starting now, and this work will touch on some of the stuff you'll see in the Pulse survey around how we work together as an organisation, as well as the ambitions and progress we're making around freedom to speak up also. So this is very much at the heart of our cultural plan that board will be seeing in November.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Mark.
Thank you, and I agree with your statement there, David, that the engagement part of this is critically important, and we can start doing that. And I won't talk about Speak Up because that's the next agenda item, but if I speak about reasonable adjustments, together with our colleagues in the Disability Equality Network, we've already started, in fact nearly completed, the engagement piece around reasonable adjustments. What we've done is we've seconded one of our colleagues from the inspection community to spend time with a significant number of colleagues across the organisation who are in need of reasonable adjustments, just to really deeply understand what are the challenges that people are experiencing, and what it is that would actually transform their experience at working at CQC, and that's a process that is almost complete now, and it will inform and embed the work that we're doing as a follow-up to that, to exactly Kate's point about measuring twice and cutting once. But that can happen quickly.
If I may just briefly come back on that, Chair. Kate, I understand that this is part of a much bigger process, but, you know, on the basis that the longest journey starts with the next step that you take, or the first step, it does seem to me that we have a lot of information that we've gathered already that could indicate changes that could be made pretty well straight away, that really would not be contentious. And, you know, they would demonstrate the importance that you're clearly taking, but it would be more obvious perhaps to everyone that culture is so important, and those immediate changes, not tomorrow, but, you know, certainly in a matter of weeks, would be an important indicator to the internal staff about the way in which we are moving in this direction, rather than just waiting until, you know, there is a very complete framework.
So I agree, but also I would point to the example that Mark's given. So we're not waiting for a cultural plan to get on and make the changes in the organisation that the LLRC talked about. So LLRC said we could do a lot better with how we support colleagues who have additional needs when it comes to interviews, when it comes to supporting them to work well at CQC. So that activity has been progressing at pace. So there is, when you get into the detail of this report, there is a wealth of activity that has already happened and is making a difference. What is to be discussed further, and you will see, is how that all draws together into the bigger cultural plan. But we're not waiting for that to get on and take some of the actions that are in the report. Thanks,
David. I had a couple of questions. One's always been dealt with, but Drew, could I just turn to you? Kate made the observation earlier that was working with our networks. I think I saw you nodding, but do you have any comments on that?
certainly I think we would like to express our thanks that we have been involved to date in a lot of the work streams that are part of the LLRC findings. I think we've had some really meaningful conversations. Certainly the work that's been alluded to in regards to reasonable adjustments is one of many conversations that we've had around this. It's a great demonstration of colleagues from marginalised communities being given a platform to share what it's like to work at CQC, some of the challenges that are faced, but also how we can improve the way that we regulate and monitor services as well. So I'm really thankful for the opportunity to do so and wish to continue to kind of build upon the foundations that have been set.
Thanks very much, Drew. I was going to ask anyway, but it seems to me to some extent it relates to David's question as well. I mean, I think I would commend the senior executive. I think one of the changes we've seen over the last several months is greater engagement with and use of organisations like the networks. I think that's great. And to your point, David, we didn't wait for the plan, or the management didn't wait for the plan to start doing that. So I think it's a good example of a step that's been taken. The other question I was going to ask, I think it's probably been dealt with, so I'll frame it more as an action for the future. But I think it's great the way you've done the detailed summary. It helps keep everybody honest that having committed to a number of actions, we haven't just thrown it away. It's there, it's visible. But at the same time, we've got to make sure that we don't lose sight of the wood for the trees here. And the big picture, we've got overall aim we're trying to achieve. So it's probably related to the point earlier about which of these things are most important. But I think as we come back, of course, do keep on with a rather more granular assessment, because unless we can do that, we can't demonstrate to people we've done what we said we'd do. But it would be very helpful as well to have some sort of higher level qualitative assessment, as said, and having done all of this, are we actually achieving what it is we set to do? Not easy, I know, but I think that would be very helpful at some stage. It will, of course, be informed by other things we'll be seeing, like pulse surveys, but I think it'll be helpful. Unless there's any other questions, let's move on with Kate, in particular. Staples, thanks so much for that. We now have a moving on to freedom to speak update, something to approve what's doing. So, Mark, I think this is with you, and are we going to be joined by Carolyn Jackson Enkinson? We thought we were going to be joined by Carolyn. Hi, Carolyn. Welcome. So I just introduced the topic. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome, Carolyn. I just wanted to introduce by saying that this Freedom to Speak Up agenda is incredibly important. I'm the executive sponsor for Freedom to Speak Up, and what Carolyn's going to talk about in a little bit here is about our improvement plan that we've got to support improvements in our Freedom to Speak Up capability. This is work that we've spent a bit of time ratifying this with the National Guardian's Office, and I think to the point that we talked about just now about measuring twice and cutting once, we're taking a little bit of time to make sure that we get this right, and we don't rush to action too quickly. There is work that's ongoing, but I think it's important that we take that time. And we had earlier on this morning was I think there's the really key element of Freedom to Speak Up is about how we engage with the organisation, how we listen to our colleagues, and we've got a number of actions that Carolyn and I are taking to ensure that we really listen to the organisation, understand what's important to our colleagues. But I'll hand over to Carolyn for a fuller update.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, so thank you everybody. I mean, we're continuing to do as much work as we can on raising awareness about freedom to speak up, and as you'll have read in the paper, we want to get some additional resource so that we can be more proactive with the work we do, because most of the work that I do, it's more reactive work, so responding to people when they come to me, and we want to be able to, you know, obviously do far more proactive work. So I was hoping that you would approve the paper, the ask for additional resource, and we would move on that. I've been very supported by Mark. It's made a huge difference actually having Mark as the exec sponsor for this work. And we've it's Freedom to Speak Up month next month. Ian and myself and Mark, we led an all staff call last week about freedom to speak up, and actually some of the feedback that I've had from that has been positive. I think staff want to see more of the executive team talking about freedom to speak up and what they think about being able to raise issues that they want to talk about. I mean, Ian does a lot of that work in his Curious Conversations, but Mark and I plan to do a bit more, and we've got a bit of a plan to do a sort of a national roadshow, if you like, to try and reach out to more people and to encourage people to come and talk to us. So has anybody got any questions at the moment?
Question, I don't. Stephen.
Firstly, very much welcome the paper and all the work that you've done, Caroline and Mark. I hope we will approve the increase in resource. I think it's important, and indeed, chatting to Mark earlier, it's very hard to know how much resource is going to be enough, because we don't really know how much unpent demand there may be in the organisation to have a freedom to speak up guardian that people can talk to. But I hope we can work on the basis that if we agree this is the next step, then, you know, we will keep it under review so that there is, you know, we don't overload the 2 additional freedom to speak up guardians if it turns out that they are kept very busy. So very much welcome that. The other point that I wanted to make is that this is very closely related to the finding in the staff survey about feeling safe to challenge the way things are done here, which I think we'd all recognise is a poor result. You know, it's a very low rating from staff in the organisation about feeling it's safe to speak up. And this set of interventions, the appointment of 2 new additional guardians working with Caroline, is a really important response to that, as well as to the recommendations of the LLRC report. The only final point I would make is that this mustn't be instead of a wider culture in which managers also are receptive to concerns. If you like, the big risk in creating identified colleagues who are freedom to speak up guardians is that other people feel, well, in that case I don't need to bother. Actually, this has to be in addition to a culture in which managers are open to hearing, really actively hearing concerns, worries, problems, whistleblowing cases from staff and their team members. So this is a reinforcement of a culture that encourages people to speak up whenever they see problems, issues, concerns that they have. It's not instead of it. Thanks.
Thanks. I think Stephen makes a great point. I think it was a conversation that myself, Caroline and Mark had on our all-colleague calls last week. There's something here for me about the difference between the concept and the process. So in terms of numbers of people and numbers of speak up guardians, that's part of the process almost. But conceptually, I think you make a really good point that if you are succeeding at a speak up culture in the organisation, you almost don't need a speak up guardian because your line managers are having routine conversations. And I think we know from work we've done in things like QI programs and other improvement work, people are just saying, oh, I think it would be good if we did this in a different way, and people are being listened to and managers are being are working constructively with their teams. And equally, I hear frequently examples where an individual's had a particular problem with something, and they've praised their manager for the way in which the manager has stepped in and been constructive. So, in some respects, the Guardian is almost the exception handler in this. So I'm kind of hoping that what we've got on the table is proportionate. I think if it's not proportionate, then we'll look again at it, and that's part of the reason why we've got an executive sponsor in the form of Mark. We have had Guardians before, but they didn't necessarily have that sort of top level support that Mark is offering Caroline. So I think we've got a good process here, but it sits on top of, I think, what is already an okay set of things. But I think we just need to examine that some more, and we need to just be very thoughtful about, if we are seeing increases, why are we seeing increases? And that might mean more Guardians, or it might mean let's look at the broader cultural work we're doing and the support we're giving for managers, and it might elicit a different response. But I think it's absolutely the right point.
Mark.
Thank you. I strongly support this, and thank you for your help and support so far in relation to this. And I'm glad that there is more resource coming to help you. I think I'm also glad that you've addressed the administration and support as well, because we want our Guardians listening and acting on concerns, not dealing with admin. And I know, Drew, that our network colleagues, one of the challenges is admin support for what they do. So anyone who's doing something in addition to their day job, it's important to cover the admin support. I think we've really got to be great at this. If our model of regulation is increasingly about listening to feedback and ensuring that people are comfortable raising their concerns with us, then we've got to be exemplars in how we do this internally. The two big barriers are always fear and futility, and I think we've got to be careful that futility is an easy one to deal with, or at least an easy one to deal with superficially, because you could just do lots of comms about how you've listened and acted on what you've been told. Fear is deeply cultural, and the controls and protections that you need in place to ensure that people don't suffer detriment 12 months on when it becomes the end of a performance cycle, or they're not turned down for another job 2 years on when they're applying for a move within the organisation. Those things are really hard to track, and I suspect quite a lot of those will be some of the red issues that we get to in the LLRC actions as well. But it's really important for us to do that. It's really important for us to deliver on everything in that action that relates to this theme in the amongst the 84 recommendations in the LLRC. And it's really important that we continue to give you the support that you need. So I guess I'm hoping that we're going to work out how we can see more of you and hear more from you as another triangulation point for us in terms of judging how much progress we're making on that journey.
Mark, other Mark.
So just one quick comment, and it probably relates between the three items we're discussing here: freedom to speak up, psychological safety, and then a broader culture conversation. It's also just an acknowledgement that we're doing this in an unusual timing, coming out of the back of COVID, the disruption that has caused, changes in the way of working, and also a fact that we've always had a dispersed organisation, and it will remain dispersed with hybrid working. So creating that psychological safety, that trust in a hybrid environment might require different actions to doing that if you are all in the same physical space. So there's maybe also, as you're adding the resources in, it would be good to see if you're already thinking about how they can actually touch an organisation that is dispersed, that works in a hybrid way. What are those day-to-day behaviours that we can implement that changes that sense of trust and safety?
I think it's a comment rather than a question, unless you wish to. David.
Thank you, Chair. In your brief presentation, which I thank you, you mentioned about becoming proactive rather than merely reactive. And it seemed to me an important part of that, following on what Mark said earlier about fear and futility, you know, being two great concerns. There is the actual ability of people to be sufficiently self-confident to actually bring these things forward. And I'm not quite sure, reading the paper, how we're going to address that.
I mean, people do come forward, and I do. I mean, although I say that all of the majority of the work that we do is reactive, that's because we spend most of the time just, you know, dealing with people when they have come forward for support. But we do go back and check with people as well to make sure that they don't feel that they've suffered any detriment from speaking up, but that's more of an informal follow-up. We don't do anything very formal monitoring.
Thank you. I understand that point. My point really was slightly different to that. It was saying that, you know, at any level in an organisation, from shop floor to board, whatever, there are those individuals who feel more self-confident about speaking up than others. And there is a danger in any organisation that you listen to the people who come forward and do that. And there is then either a significant minority or a substantial majority, one doesn't know, who are not coming forward because they don't feel the self-confidence to do that, in addition to the points that Mark has raised about fear of futility. But there is that aspect. Now, for this to be really effective, I think we need to think about how best we can address that.
Yeah, completely. And some of the things that we do, I mean, I yesterday went to one of the networks on their all-staff call, did a presentation about what Freedom Speak Up is, how you can talk to me, the sorts of things that you might want to come and raise, talked about going to your line manager. So we try to raise awareness in a lot of different ways. And the other thing that I say we because there are some Freedom Speak Up ambassadors that help and support a bit. But if we get some intelligence as well, I mean, you know, I'm an inspector by background, so if I get a little sense that something might not be quite right, we will seek people out a little bit to a certain extent. I mean, obviously we can't just be doing that all of the time, but sometimes people just need that little bit of support. So yeah, very aware of that. Thanks, David.
Can I just come in on the back of that? I think to answer your kind of underlying question, David, I think it's not entirely Carolyn's job. I think Carolyn can talk to the freedom to speak up part, but I do think, you know, what we are doing is looking for ways to design in opportunities that people can talk about things. So if we look at transformation, for example, you know, we're creating opportunities for inspectors to be part of the design team, where the designers are working alongside inspectors in real time. When we've gone live with our first release, we've listened to what's been said, we've recycled that information back in. I run a series of curious conversations, which are groups of about 10 people, and we just sit and talk about any issues that they want to talk about. I know, you know, a number of other colleagues run similar calls or face-to-face meetings, so we try and create those spaces where people feel that confidence to speak up about whatever it is that they want to talk about. And I think it's, you know, it would be fair to say that, you know, if I think back to my own experience, you know, when I was 25, 30 years of age in my first job, I would not have emailed the Chief Constable of Surrey Police to tell him what I thought, but I probably would have spoken up if something was genuinely dangerous or illegal. And so that, I think there is something here about creating a series of opportunities for people to talk about a range of things, which is what we're trying to build into the range of engagement mechanisms. And Speak Up, the Speak Up Guardian process is kind of is an important component of that, but there's a lot of other things I think that go into that. But this whole issue of culture change, this whole issue of people development is really important, because we do need our inspectors in particular to have the self-confidence to call out things that they see when they're on inspection, and I think that building of self-confidence is part of our overall organisational development activity. So I think it's a big package of things.
Drew, you wanted to comment?
Thank you. And Caroline, thank you for the work that you've done to date on this. We, as Equality Network chairs, handle some matters of concern at a local level. We share themes and trends with our executive sponsors, and we signpost to the Freedom to Speak Up process where appropriate. Recognising the comments that colleagues have raised in regards to that level of fear and futility, I wonder if actually there's, recognising the trusted position that we have within our own communities, more opportunity for the chairs and co-chairs to do more with you and with the programme to better support our colleagues and provide another conduit for colleagues to share concerns.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Drew, and that's one of the things, when we get more capacity, we'll be able to do.
No comments from others. I mean, just one from me, and also by way of summary. I mean, there's obviously, so thank you very much for the papers. There's obviously huge widespread agreement. We know it's going to cost, but that's absolutely essential. This is important, so no problem with that. The point's been made that, you know, this is a step, a bit of a guess as this is right, so we'll come back and look at it again. In that context, just to say, I mean, a different way of saying the point Ian Trenner made, that if you got the culture perfectly right, there wouldn't be any need for any of this. So I suppose I liken it, using risk management speak, to a second line of defence. You know, if something's not going right, there is a way that people can get their voice heard in another way. It would be completely naive to think that we will get to the stage of no reporting. I mean, the immediate response, and any board I've ever sat on, is if there's no speaking up, say there's something wrong with the process, not that the organisation is perfect. So we work on the assumption there will be reporting. What would be really helpful from you, I think, is to understand and report back to the board on themes emerging as to why it is that people felt it was necessary to do that. Because I think that will instruct, maybe it'll input to culture, but also some of the process things we're talking about. So it'd be really helpful in a year, 6, 12 months, whenever this comes back, to understand what you're learning and why it is that people felt it necessary to use that approach as opposed to all the other stages that Ian talked about. So thank you very much indeed for the work, Mark. Thanks for that. We know it's been well appreciated, and I do appreciate your feedback on these things as well, Drew. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
So Ian, we have a couple of papers from you and your team. So I'll hand this over to you.
Thanks, Ian. If I could just try and talk to both papers perhaps at the same time, and then colleagues can answer questions. Either I and colleagues will answer questions. On one level, I'd like to sort of apologise for the length of the papers in the pack, but I think it does talk to the fact there's quite a lot going on at the moment, and I think there's a significant amount of work that we are doing in the wider world. We've got a wider world which is very much under pressure. I think what we're seeing that translating to is, as we see the sectors that we regulate under pressure, we're seeing increases in the amount of risk that's there. We're seeing increases in the amount of enforcement notices that we have to issue, increases in the amount of things like safeguarding activity, and exploring that for our inspectors to explore that takes time and takes energy to do. The work, I think, also as a consequence of that, is also becoming more complex. And what we're continuing to try and do is to balance speaking for those that use services with making sure that we are trying to take into account the context in which people are trying to deliver services. And I think that's a constant challenge for us to things at the same time. Challenges like workforce availability in services are a big issue. I think the cost of living crisis in sectors that are high users of power, food and industrial consumables, again, are placing enormous financial and practical pressure on those who are delivering services. And we've got a number of things on our agenda that talk to that. But I think we have a series of pieces of work in our report, things like the National Maternity Programme, urgent and emergency care, dementia care, intermediate care, services for learning disabled and autistic people. and they're all aimed at balancing our inspection and assurance work with making contributions towards improvement. And I think, you know, when we talk about our strategy, we talk a lot about making a contribution to improvement, and all of our transformation work is trying to make us more effective in that space. So we're trying to make sure that we are true to our core purpose of providing the public with assurance as well as promoting improvement. Alongside all of this, our pilot work on local authority assurance and integrated care system assessment is continuing. That is, stating the obvious, one of the largest expansions of our powers since we came into being as an organisation over a decade ago. We're looking forward to welcoming 190 new colleagues from the MNSI programme, which is currently hosted within Health Service Investigation Branch. They're coming across to us on the 1st of October. I think that's a real opportunity for us. I think it's an area, maternity is an area that we have identified repeatedly in various state of care reports as being an area that we have significant concern on. I think bringing in the investigation capability across to us and bringing our ability to collaborate together, both for the work that the MNSI team are doing plus the work that we're doing, I think offers a real opportunity for us to improve safety in maternity services. We've gone live with our first really important release of our new regulatory approach, and we'll be continuing further releases during October, including opening up the provider portal. We said for a long time that we want to make ourselves easier to do business with. Providers constantly tell us that that sending us paperwork and just dealing with us is hard. We know that opening up the portal will make all of that much easier. It will also mean that from a reporting point of view, internally and externally, that will also improve. We've had some really constructive conversations with our trades unions over the last few months. We've resolved both last year's pay dispute and also we've made sure that we've been able to give our colleagues a good pay rise this year as well. And I'm really grateful to the constructive way in which trades union colleagues have talked to us on a range of topics, and I'm looking forward to working with them closely over the coming year as we think about our pay scheme in the future. And I say all of this really to make the point that we are at a point in our development as an organisation. It's probably arguably one of the busiest times we've ever seen. We're transforming the organisation. We're trying to make sure that we're doing our day job, as it were, in an environment which externally is pretty tough. And I just wanted to make sure that we were all as a board completely sighted on that. And I think, having said all of that, though, I think the importance of all of this is that the work that we're doing will put us as an organisation on a much more sustainable footing. It will mean that we're making investments for the medium term. I think there is always the risk at this time of year and at a point in where we are seeing such busyness externally to focus on the here and now. I think what we're trying to do is pull off that really difficult trick of focusing on the here and now, as well as making sure we're making investments for the future, whether that's in technology, whether that's in terms of organisational design, whether that's in terms of culture, which is obviously a conversation that we've just been having. So I think lots of important items on the agenda, lots of important pieces of work in the report, and happy to take questions, and obviously colleagues can contribute as well. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, thanks. Christine.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a question on page 24 about key result 2, and it's partly a clarification and partly a question, and I think I might have raised this before anyway, but it states that 85% of inspections this financial year were triggered by risk, and then in the colour-coded section further on, it says that the target of increasing inspections triggered by risk is not met. So I just wanted to understand, I mean, I do appreciate that either risks are increasing or we're identifying them better. I don't know which of those two things, probably a combination. But what is the target? And given that we're trying to increase the number of risk-triggered inspections, what how are we going to, what's the strategy around regulating and identifying good and outstanding practice?
Chris will correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think the measure is increasing from the percentage from last year. And whilst we're at 85% this year, I think last year we were slightly higher. So that's why the measure in the business plan is not met, although 85% is still a lot of risk. At the moment, as we are going through the sort of hopefully the end stages of our transformation program, we are particularly focused on risk at the moment. But I think there will be discussions about how we operate during the winter, because last year the adult social care colleagues did a lot of increasing capacity inspections during the winter, but also I think as we look to adopt our single assessment framework going into the new year, I think that we will be much more agile then when it comes to looking at good providers and then judging whether they are outstanding or indeed requires improvement providers who are good. So I think our focus on risk will continue in the immediate term, but the performance measure was slightly down on last year. I think that's right, Chris?
Answer your question, Christine? Any other questions for... Yeah, David.
If I may, Chair, it's really a comment to Ian. Ian, I think you passed rather quickly over the fact that you'd successfully resolved the pay situation, and I think, you know, it is worth commenting that that's a great achievement, and you know, you did it sort of Austria, really. It's tremendous to do that. Most organisations who are comparable to ours have not had that success, and I just think it should. Congratulations to be given to you and your team in bringing that off.
Thanks, David. I think our colleague Jackie Jackson, who's our Director of People, really deserves the credit for that. Jackie's done a lot of work with colleagues in the trade unions, but also I think there's some credit to our trade union colleagues for coming to the table. It takes two to tango, I think, and I think they've been very constructive recently as well, which has been really helpful.
Yes, but it's great success.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
James.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to amplify the point about at this board we are between now and our next board in November will conclude the pilot stages for the local authority assurance assessments. So we've completed the field work in 5 of those, and we are now at that stage of writing reports with indicative ratings and sharing those with the local authorities. And following that, we'll be in discussions with DHSC about us moving formally from pilot mode into delivery mode. So it's been a significant amount of work to get to an organisational design to deliver that. We are on track to deliver that, and it looks as if our methodology and our quality statements that we've used have got to the heart of whether a local authority is implementing the Care Act or not. And the feedback from the councils involved has been positive. They have all felt as if our process had an anticipatory impact on them looking at their own services and the quality of people's experience, and it's been very successful at bringing in the voice of lived experience in those areas, with independent meetings with those people and really bringing their voice through. So I think we can assure ourselves as a board that actually this process and this new significant duty that Ian was outlining, you know, it is of significance and will be a weighty amount of work. And the other point I wanted to make is that both the LA work and the ICS work gets us back into systems work. And so some of the questions that are raised in the update insights paper about dementia or intermediate care, we now have an opportunity at system level to start asking those questions. So it is really a significant moment for CQC in moving into this territory between now and Christmas time. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the update, James, and no doubt we'll be hearing more next meeting or before. I mean, I suppose we have to accept the fact that the local authorities were positive to some extent, self-selected through the pilots, but that's not to detract from the progress. What I found particularly pleasing was the anticipatory element, because again, I think a big shift or so in the last little while is to say make sure we're doing our work in a way that encourages improvement. So if the sheer fact of this is coming up is requiring people to look again at what they're doing, and do things better. I mean, that's the real win for the system, isn't it? Rather than the fact that ultimately out of this they may get a rating. Christine.
Thanks. I just wanted to amplify that again because my son happens to be a sort of community activist worker in the Northwest, and he told me that the moment the local authority assessments were introduced, he saw a change in the local authorities he's working with. So it's felt from both sides, not just from local authorities saying they're doing it, but actually from people working within the community. So, you know, that's very positive, really, and it shows that there is an impact on improvement.
Turning into a mini self-congratulatory session, but thanks very much, James, and well done. Any other questions for Ian? Okay, well look, Ian, I mean, you covered a huge amount in your oral update, and I think we get the point that there's a huge amount going on, and it, in some ways, it makes it almost critical time for this organisation, because there's a few things are going to get slightly worse. We were through a period of a few things peaking and going down, but just at the moment, everyone's very busy, so well done. I think, move on to the corporate performance report. And so, Kate, raising hand to you in a moment, and Mark Sutton and Chris Usher. I think we're going to invite Stephanie Tarrant for your team, Chris, to join us. Welcome, Stephanie. Whatever we discuss or agree, we end up giving all the hard work to you anyway, so it's probably very sensible you join us. Right, Kate, I'll hand this to you.
Thank you. So presenting to you today performance of the first quarter of this financial year, 23-24. I'm going to hand over to Chris shortly to talk you through the performance report and an update on finance. And we've got Steph here to support us with questions, and then Chris will hand back to me where I will just walk you through the final page in the pack, talks about risks that exceed tolerance. And I'm just going to give board a brief update on where we are with those red risks that exceed tolerance. But I'll hand over to Chris now.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So this is our quarter one performance report, including July where possible, acknowledging there wasn't a board in August. There's a lot in here, so I'll just run through some headlines, and it's also a new format report that we've included that in this return. So we've chunked this up by the strategy themes. So just looking under people and communities. So the key result one, which is safeguarding alerts and whistleblowing. So we've met some of our corporate KPIs. However, as the report shows, we have not met our target. It's primarily due to a temporary issue following the go live of a contact service in July, largely relating to our ability to refer priority one safeguarding alerts to local authorities. Pleased to say that was resolved at pace and levels are now back where they expected, but for this reporting period it's shown as not met. There's a similar story, if you like, in NCSE response times. In first quarter, NCSE was exceeding all targets. However, in July we've seen a dip in performance on safeguarding and mental health outlines, again largely due to the impact of our contact service rollout. And we've seen an improvement from them at that point, and we're now close to, if not on target, again. So both those areas just had a dip in performance, as you say. Just moving further ahead, key result 2, just under our smarter regulation theme. Sorry, people and communities theme. For the year July, 16% of our inspections have been carried out based on people's experience and feedback. So I think it's an important demonstration just in the impact of people's feedback on our approach. So yes, we'll inspect based on risk, but in 16% of occasions, we've actually responded directly to the feedback we've had from the public, kind of demonstrating how this really informs our approach and how we're able to adapt. I was going to talk about inspections triggered by risk, but I'll not touch on that because we've just covered that, so I'll skate on from that one. In terms of out of hours inspections, just moving on to our next theme on smart regulation. So we aim for 10% of site visits to be undertaken out of hours. We're seeing progress in this area. We're currently at 10.2%. We're at 9.2% last year. It's worth noting with this measure that there is still work to do on defining kind of out of hours and what our definition of that, and that will help enhance our reporting around this. But as the measure stands in the business plan, we are showing we are meeting that target that we set out. On key results 7, which is around registration applications, currently 29% of registration applications are over 10 weeks old in the system. That is an increase from last year, so we're aiming to reduce that, but currently that's proving a challenge. It is worth noting, though, that the volumes of application received is increased by 7.8% from that period. So it's a story of a larger backlog, but with increased volumes as context. Just moving on to some of our key results around protected characteristics. So key result 17, we've seen good progress in this space. So we're aiming to increase the percentage of colleagues with protected characteristics. So colleagues of minority and ethnic origin has increased from 14.7% in the end of 22-23 quarter 4 to 14.9% year to date. And similarly, those declaring a disability has increased from 10.8% to 11.7% over the same period. So both heading in the right direction. However, we are seeing a challenge in nudging the dial, if you like, on those colleagues reporting protected characteristics, which is key result 18. That's kind of stayed steady through each month of the year. So more work to do in that space. We've included a couple of pages on milestones. So we have a number of milestones within our business plan. Some have interdependencies with our wider transformation, both in rolling out a single assessment framework as well as our new regulatory platform. It shows some progress we've made, but in a number of areas there is more work to do, which links to a lot of the key results I've talked about. I'll not touch on risk, as Kate referenced that. She will come back to that. There are 7 risks that are currently outside of exceeding our tolerance that we set, which I'll hold on talking to. So if I just finish with our finances, at the end of July, there's a 1.3 million surplus on revenue expenditure. We're currently forecasting a 3.7 million deficit for the year. This includes 1.9 million of work that is currently unfunded in relation to our COVID inquiry. The remaining pressures relate to pay agreements which have been handled in year, not part of budget setting. So we're kind of actively looking to mitigate those pressures. Our capital budget is 1.8 million overspent for the year to July. That's forecast currently to be 1.4 million by the end of the year, but current indications are that will increase, and we'll see that overspend increase by the time we report on this next time. I'll pause there if you want to touch on risk and open out for any questions from anyone.
Well, if we we'll take risk separately. That was the question I asked, so we'll come back to that and outside tolerance. But questions on any other aspect of the report? Belinda.
Thanks. I'm back to my out of hours again. but just, you know, for me, an out of hours inspection is not one that starts in hours and finishes after out of hours. And I've probably said that every board meeting we've ever spoke about out of hours, so I'll say it again. But I know that you were looking at things, weren't you, Tyson, about, you know, a genuine out of hours, maybe weekends, nights, bank holidays, that type of thing. And I think you thought that might be concluded around Octoberish time with the unions, just people are properly supported and paid for doing that type of work. And I just wondered if you could give us an update on that.
No, very happy to, Belinda. The work's been a bit delayed for reasons I won't go into, but I'm confident that we will put some momentum behind it, and I'm sure we'll talk about it at the Regulatory Governance Committee in a couple of weeks' time. We're still talking to the unions about it. We're looking at the health and safety aspects and the remuneration aspects, and when that goes live, we will then adopt the new definition. And the new definition is that the entire inspection takes place outside of hours, or takes place entirely at the weekend or bank holidays, or a substantial part of it, at least 3 hours, happens before 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. So we're getting there. We're just not quite there yet. And I think when we move into the new world, that's when we'll adopt the new definition. You're quite right. The definition we've got at the moment is not the one we want to carry on with.
I think I've got to know Belinda well enough to say you'll keep on getting the question, as you said this way. Christine and then Stephen.
I don't want to preempt discussion that's going to happen in a while, but I just did think that it's worth noting that key result 19, which is increased positive sentiment on recommending CQC as a place to work, is recorded as met, and I wouldn't want it to look like the board feels complacent about that it's recognised by the board that there is a concern around it. So I just wanted to say that in this section.
Worth, for the record, having a response to that, Kate.
Thank you, Christine. So it is met technically because it had improved on the previous stat. The previous stat was something like 36%. So none of us are resting on our laurels thinking that is a good enough statistic. You know, in an ideal world, everyone working at CQC would recommend it as a place to work. So so good point, and the action is still. This is not a good news story on that one.
Stephen.
Thank you, Chris, and others for the report. Thank you, Steph. The one request I think I would make for future reporting is the use of the rating monitor and on hold, because I think the majority of items here are not in fact RAG rated as to whether they're met or not met. They're just monitor. I think probably it would be more useful if we had a sense of, well, what does good look like? What are we trying to achieve here? So we're not just kind of watching it, but we have a sense of direction and purpose as to, well, where are we trying to get to, and then you report on whether we're getting there. So it's really just a request that we try to remove these various monitors, never mind the on holds. Second question, Chris, was you reported your expectation that as things currently stand, we're projecting overspends on revenue and capital. Can I push you to give your confidence level that by the end of the year we will be fully within budget on both revenue and capital? Thanks.
Thanks for that, Stephen. So I'll approach this. Revenue, yes, except we have got a problem and a challenge with the COVID expenditure because that's currently not funded. So that aside, I think revenue, we should be on budget. Capital, less confident. That is a challenge at the minute. And as I alluded to, I've seen our kind of latest figures increasing and overspend that territory, which at this moment in time, I would say would be a challenge to come back on budget. So that one is very much work in progress. Revenue, more confident about.
Any other questions? I mean, just before we come to risk, well, but firstly, maybe picking up on Stephen. Sorry? Can I come to you in a second, Drew? Let me be current. Before we come to risk, first picking up on Stephen's point, I do take your point, monitors isn't very helpful. Whether or not we could put something in there, or whether we should draw out a distinction between performance indicators, which is where we want to see whether we're performing at a level we want, versus other things which are factors for information. And there are certain things about volumes of what's going on in the sector. It's interesting, I think, for us to know as a board, because we have to respond to that. But if it's without our control, I would probably record it separately or not have monitor, but we can sort that out. I just want to be clear, there are a number of things in here where we've got gaps on measures or on the milestones we say have no update. So how soon will it be before we've closed those gaps and they're going to be able to have some updates?
Sorry, next board we'll have a full update and any gaps will be addressed.
Drew.
Thank you. Welcome the addition of figures around sexuality under key result 17. I think this is the first time that's been included, so thank you for drawing together that information. We know that there's been a historic challenge around declaration for not just sexuality but a number of protected characteristics, which may very well be as a consequence of some of the findings mentioned already from the Pulse survey. I also recognise that there's a higher percentage for the LGBTQIA plus community as not stated, so there's work for us to do as a network to address that. I'm hoping that those figures are going to increase as we continue the important work that we're doing around culture. I also want to just acknowledge the fact that we're also doing some, quite fantastic work with the diversity and inclusion team around recruitment and hopefully that will again contribute to an increased rate of declaration from the outset when somebody joins the organisation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Drew. I appreciate that. So, Chris, I don't know whether you or Kate are going to take this, but there are a number of things where we are showing our risk as now being outside appetite, exceeding tolerance, or the phrase you use. I mean, the concept of an appetite approved by the board is relatively new, so I appreciate this is settling down and these things are inherently subjective. But if we're saying these things are not within the appetite the board has described, can you give us a brief overview of say, keep it brief in the circumstances, but why and what are we doing about it and what sort of timescale? I think for the future, if we're going to report to the board things that are outside appetite, it would be helpful to have that in the report, because that's really the, I suppose, the feature of a dynamic risk management framework is that the key point about identifying it's out of appetite is to say, so what do we then do about it? But for now, if you just give the board a brief overview, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. So the first one on your on the risk annex that is outside appetite is we don't have effective governance frameworks in place. This is one where there has been work undertaken, but not sufficient in order for it to bring down the exceeding tolerance judgment that it's got. So there's been an important piece of work Sash has been leading around how we make decisions underneath the exec committee. So we've done a refresh of our ET subcommittees, refresh of terms of reference, installing exec colleagues as chairs of those subcommittees, so they're formal subcommittees of the board. We are in train of creating a new subcommittee to support us with organisational prioritisation that we will update you all on soon. So there is work in motion, but it's not sufficiently progressed to bring down that judgment. The next one is we don't deliver transformation effectively within the organisation. A huge topic that I won't get into now. The key thing I would say relates to a comment Ian made earlier. So we went live with some really new important ways of working back in July. We listened to our colleagues who work in the organisation who said that they needed a bit more time to get ready for the second wave of new functionality, new ways of working to go live. We listened to that and we planned our approach based on that feedback from staff. So it's still a high risk. It's still exceeding tolerance because we're in the kind of final 6-ish months of delivering this pretty epic transformation programme. But the way we are mitigating that is demonstrating to our people how we're listening and kind of course correcting according to their feedback. The third risk is the risk around getting the right data from external stakeholders. Helen Lowrens, who reports to Mark Sutton, had a session at ARAC, our Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, maybe about a month or so ago, around the work they're doing in TDI, our Data and Insight Directorate, to have a dedicated resource to address the issues around getting timely access to information from partners. But again, that work needs to have progressed further for that risk to come down. A couple of others, the risk around not attracting and retaining our workforce. This is for very specific pockets within our organisation. So pockets within technology, pockets within legal. So this is a specific risk. I think in legal, the risk is as high as ever, much to the challenge that Kate Staples and her team are having to deal with, predominantly around retaining, we're getting great colleagues, we support them and they do some fabulous work for us and then they move on. So that's an outstanding risk. Anthony Snape and Technologies doing some interesting work around how we can get people in and grow them within technology. So that risk remains, but it's within kind of specific pockets of the organisation. We've got a risk around ensuring our colleagues are sufficiently engaged in culture change that we've already talked about before. Lots of work underway to support our colleagues through change. Needs to be presented as a coherent cultural plan that you'll be seeing in a month or two's time. And then the last two red risks exceeds tolerance is around our operational workforce being productive and ensuring that we accurately and timely assess the quality of care out there in providers. Just to flag to board that both of those risks will be having a deep dive in Regulatory Governance Committee in a couple of weeks' time, chaired by Mark Chambers, where they will get into the depth of mitigation on that, and then following that discussion we'll review whether those that exceeding tolerance is still the right judgment for those two items.
Thanks very much, Kate. I mean, for those kind of less familiar, important to say we're not saying that report is fundamentally broken, but I think it's the power of the process, some honesty that says, you know, things are not as we would like, and we're going to have to take some actions to deal with it. I appreciate some of these are not within our control to deal with. I mean, if a market's very hot in certain skilled areas, I think anybody be surprising if a lot of organisations don't find it would have to report they find it very difficult to get the IT staff they need. Any other questions or comments for any of the team, including Stephanie? Okay, well, Stephanie, I think you got off relatively light at that time. Some updates, a few things your boss has committed you to delivering in November. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye
bye. Moving swiftly on, as they say, Pulse survey results. I think we're going to be joined by Jackie Jackson. Oh, Jackie. Kate, shall I just hand over to you and Jackie to, obviously we've seen the paper on the results, but comment on a bit more detail, and then we'll allow time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all. So we are having a conversation today about our Pulse survey that we undertook in May of this year, with a real focus on diversity and inclusion. So we needed to get really key information from this survey to inform the equality, diversity and inclusion strategy and the workforce and disability race workforce disability equality standards and the race equality standards, the item with which we will have next. Just want to note the timing of this. So the survey happened in May. We had very early insights from the organisation who provided the survey for us ahead of last board, but not sufficient in order to have the full conversation then. So I just want to note the time that has elapsed in terms of us having this conversation, but also to say we haven't not been doing anything over the summer since we've had these findings. I will hand over shortly to Jackie to talk you through the findings. I think it would be fair to say they are very disappointing results. There are there are some examples of where we've seen improvement, but nowhere near where we would want our organisation to be. We all know that happy workforce means that we are providing a high quality of service, and it's really important that our people are positive and are feeling well supported to do their job. So we take these results very seriously, and there is a wealth of action happening on the back of that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jackie to bring to life some of the highlights from the paper.
So there's such a lot of information that's been shared in the pack, and board have got the full suite now. I don't intend to go through any specific line by line. I think what we can highlight is engagement in the survey was significant at over 2,000 colleagues who took part. That said, I think just to echo Kate's words, the contents were concerning and saddened to read. And I think we would be naive not to acknowledge that. In saying that, I think prior to the survey, which was a golden thread to LLR and also transformation and the work with Nadia and the staff networks and Mark, we'd already started to undertake a considerable work programme in terms of some elements that were highlighted in the Pulse survey. Just as a reminder, the Pulse survey, a number of questions were specifically targeted to inform our D&I strategy and the Res and Des reports. So that's given us quite rich data in terms of the work we already started to do and what still needs to be undertaken in terms of colleagues who got protected characteristics. So what I was going to do really was just to share some of the activities that are underway, that we are considering. Nadia is going to also just outline some of the work that she's doing as well, and then happy to take any questions from there. So in terms of thinking about colleagues with disabilities. We are overhauling and looking at the end-to-end recruitment programme to support colleagues who want additional support. And taking that one step further to looking at the recruitment areas that we actually target, so we can be an employee of choice for those in society with disabilities. We have got internally the inclusive leadership pathway, and as of the last tranche of colleagues, 39 people were on the programme and 7 colleagues had gained promotions. So we're tracking that through, looking at feedback and monitoring the performance of colleagues who are actually undertaking the training. Undertaking workshops to really start and unpick the findings from the survey. A lot of the data in there, whilst we are concerned about it, it's quite hard to disseminate. So we need more work to be able to really understand what we're being told and what the response is. And Nadia can cover that off in some of the workshops that she's been arranging and hosting. A lot of work and reasonable adjustments with our staff network colleagues in terms of how we support colleagues throughout the employment life cycle. And with Mark's sponsorship, a good piece of visionary work done, which will start to inform further the work that we've already started. And then working with TU colleagues as well, because I think we've got to acknowledge that our TUs work with many organisations and can bring their thoughts and ideas and what they've seen work really well, so that we can work with them to implement where we think fit for CQC. I think that covers everything off. Nadia, is there anything you want to add?
Thanks, Jackie. Just to build on Jackie's point, we'll be engaging widely with staff from September to November. For example, there will be externally facilitated focus groups. We'll be supporting directors to have conversations with their teams. We'll also be engaging with the quality networks and other expert teams, for example, mental health and well-being, estates, health and safety, so we can further explore the results, and that will enable us to tailor our interventions in the short and long term.
Just to add, I think as well, there's a golden thread with the work that we're looking at here with the LLR report and also the work on culture and transformation and the Speak Up Guardian. I think it's just sort of like part of one global offering. And I think the important thing is also to make sure it's joined up and it isn't a siloed approach. So happy to take any questions.
Questions? Stephen.
Firstly, thank you, Jackie, Nadia, colleagues. It's really important to have this information, painful though it is. So good for you for collecting it and reporting it in the honest and frank way that you have. And please can we keep tracking progress. 2 much more specific points. One of the most significant changes from the previous survey is the proportion of discrimination that's attributed to senior leadership. Kind of, what do you make of that? And the second quite specific question, there are 2 responses in here. One is about primary reason for continuing to work here is by far the most popular reason for continuing to work at CQC is work-life balance and flexibility. And there's another one which is the most common form of, I think it's abuse and harassment, is in the form of email. And where this is taking me is just kind of wondering, do we need to do a piece of work about people's experience of working from home? Because you're much more likely to get emails that you may then find offensive if you're not in the office. People are clearly finding an awful lot of benefit and gain, hence the work-life balance question, which is strongly positive. But I wonder whether it's worth asking people, are you also seeing some negatives, particularly around sense of team, the ability to have those softer conversations, the socialisation that goes with being in the office? I just wondered whether this is giving us some indicators that it might just be worth consulting colleagues specifically. What's your experience of working from home versus working from the office? And do we need to have another look at that? Thanks.
So if I come to leadership first, clearly the data is telling us a story. I think the challenge with this at the moment is in terms of the backup data we have. So if we're to look at some of our casework, speak up guardians, albeit anonymous, it doesn't really speak to the reporting of the Pulse survey, which that makes it quite difficult to try and unpick. So I think that's where the workshops that we're starting to run, to start and unpick, and to your point exactly, specific questions, and giving colleagues the opportunity to speak in a secure environment, their experience or observations, thoughts, what they would like to see, because it's only by doing that and having those good conversations that we're going to be able to drill down, because the survey, whilst so important, only goes so far, and for me it's about the start of that conversation, and it's certainly not the end of it. That's the start and where we should be highlighting. The other thing with leadership is I think there is a link to working from home, and it's about the human touch. And I think, all of us, regardless of our position, have good days and bad days. And actually, how do we check that how our email is landing to somebody who is, again, having a good day or a bad day? So I think that fits into our leadership and management training that's already in hand, but actually needs to reflect some of the findings from the workshop and also some of the content from this, and just being able to sort of go through what we are hearing, what we're observing methodically, and docking it in to what we've either already gotten trained or what we're going to implement collectively, and taking ownership, because it doesn't land on any one person's shoulders. This is all of our responsibilities.
Can I just come in on the homework point that I think is that you've made, Stephen? So I think it's really important to acknowledge that up there with why people work at CQC, along with purpose, is the flexibility. So it's something that really matters to our people, and I think any sort of hint that isn't going to be what's on offer would not be a message we'd want out there. However, when we talk about culture, and we talk about how you create a good culture, I think it would be really important to have conversations with teams about how do you ensure that you are coming together for good, whether it's away days or, shared learning, etc. So might there be more we can do in terms of highlighting what best practice looks like in the organisation, about regularly checking in, so you can have, if you're needing to have difficult conversations, you're having it face to face rather than emails that get interpreted. But I think any sort of hint that the level of flexibility that we currently afford people wouldn't be continuing, wouldn't be helpful. But also I don't think a diktat that says this is how we should work, but I think we've got work to do in terms of having a conversation as the organisation about what does good look like when it comes to team bonding, team spending time together in person as well.
Just can I be clear of a couple of questions, but the suggestion from Stephen was doing some work about working from home. I mean, it's something we have talked about before, because we never set out to design the model we've got. COVID made us switch one way, and then we sort of drifted back a bit. So I don't have a good feel for whether, if we were to work out the ideal model, what we've got is anywhere close to it. I mean, it must be close, otherwise we wouldn't have any positive results, but you know what I mean. Intellectually, we haven't looked at it. So I do think it's worth capturing Stephen's point as to going beyond what you're saying, I think, of looking at what works well and what doesn't work well, but of taking stock firstly of how people find it. Are they spending the right amount of time at home versus the office. I'm not talking about necessarily a radical shift, dragging people in, but I'm saying rather than spending all the time at home, how many physical interactions do you need with colleagues and which one? But then to the extent people are working from home, are there any other things we could do to downplay some of these other problems, including, for example, use of email? So I'll leave it with you to think about it, but I think it's a very good point. I can see a number of people nodding. I think it's worth looking at it both from an element of theoretical perspective, but also, of course, capture the good practice internally where it exists, and obviously maybe evidence of what doesn't work. There were a couple of other questions. A couple of other comments. I'll come to those. But Tyson, did you want to respond to that?
I just wanted to respond to, I think there are probably two issues here, because I agree with Stephen, and I remember when I started working from home for the first time at the start of COVID, it was a different experience. Actually, it could be quite lonely at times, and I think doing some work with our people about what it feels like, it is absolutely right. But you would expect the grizzled ops director to say this. I don't think that people working from home is just about flexibility in their work-life balance. I also think it's more productive, because quite a lot of the people in this workforce are working out in local areas, and I think it's much more efficient to be living in the local area you're inspecting in than having to travel an hour and a half each way to get to Birmingham to take a desk in the office. So I think we're in a different situation when it comes to offices. Where I think the chair is right is about personal interactions, and I think there are times when we should talk to our teams about when do they come together, as teams, and that should be done in person. But I think there are a number of things spinning here, but I definitely think doing some work into the working from home experience would be the right thing to do.
So I think it'd be quite helpful if at some stage we could come back to here with sort of views of some, we don't want to mandate exact ways of working, but some guidance and maybe even some minimum standards. I mean, I really would struggle, I think, say, if we employed somebody who had never met physically another member of staff for a certain period of time. I see lots of hands going up, so apologies if I'm not getting quite the right order. I think, Drew, you want to, you go first, Mark. I think David, and then this Mark.
Thank you. Tyson, very well put what I was really going to say, but I just want to highlight the absolute benefits of working from home, or that level of flexibility that offers, particularly around colleague well-being, caring arrangements, and the flexibility that offers to many colleagues, particularly but not limited to lone parents, the financial expense that people are encountering having to commute and such as well. So I'd be really keen for us to be considerate of the overwhelming benefits that colleagues have found when we were able to move into a more flexible arrangement. Thank you.
Thank you. So one ask and one potential suggestion. Starting with this is I think we have to remember this was done in May, and actually this is a time of great change and fast change, so we may not be in the same situation now as we were in May, but important to look at that. The one part of this is we're asking a lot of the organisation in terms of change. We're putting them through a lot of change, and change is difficult, and it also is not organisational change, it always comes back to personal change. I think there's a really critical message here for leadership, and that's the board as a totality, non-exec directors and executive team, and the executive team, to say there is a desire here from the organisation to see some personal change about how the leadership handles and the culture it creates. I know we're starting that work, but it's important to think about that at a collective level for the board and at an individual level for each leader, to say what am I going to do differently to foster the future culture that I want to see, that is one where people do feel free to speak up, where there is not a view that challenging conversations are harassment, but they are constructive and supportive. So I think there's that message, and I think there's a degree of ownership we have to take and drive that through at an individual and collective level. So it needs to be on the agenda. The suggestion was, and I think it's a build really on what Stephen sort of said. I think there may be a correlation between working from home, but what is really clear is that you need trust at the very heart of this, and actually things like working from home reduce the opportunity to build that trust. But this is also an organisation that has to be, by its nature, highly accountable. and every individual has to be accountable. So I think the other part in this audit, or looking at what's changed with working from home, is how do we drive that supportive accountability? We can't duck away from challenging and difficult conversations because they're essential to the job that we do, but you have to do it in a way that it comes across as supportive, not as harassment or bullying. And I think there's probably a line there where we need to support people's ability to have those supportive accountability conversations.
Sorry, James, I might have skipped over you and I said over there, so you next, and then you, David.
Thanks very much. I wanted to welcome the report as well, and I've welcomed the discussion that I've had in my functional area to get underneath some of these issues there, but also the conversation here. And I think it is right that we are as transparent and as open and as respectful as we can be with these findings. As a relative newbie to CQC, I do recognise that the enormous strain created by both the transformation and new ways of working. But I also wanted to, I suppose, make the point about, as I look across other public services, many public services are under strain as a result of increased demand and of distress by the consequences of that demand that we are seeing. And we are an organisation that will see that stuff coming through our doors that's a consequence of the general health and social care state, as it were, and then combined with an easy ability to get behind with work because of that demand and because of the ways of working, can create a very toxic response, and other public bodies are experiencing similar to ours. So to state the obvious, a commitment from executive level to support the initiatives that are underway and to try and make those as successful as possible. But I think even where we can't solve the problem of the demand or speed up the transformation because it's too risky to speed up and we need to do it right, we can and should create that culture where people feel that they can speak out and speak up. So I think staff will really welcome the board's support for that, visible support in this meeting and further engagements actually at board and executive level to sort of demonstrate that as we go along. Very much the point that Mark is making, that we can be very visible with our behaviour without solving a problem, and people understand that, because we cannot control the whole of the problem, but we can control the way we behave with it. Thank you, Chair.
David, sorry, do you want to go next? Lots of hands going up.
Thank you, Jackie and Nadia. Mine's a question for you, really, about the workshops that you've mentioned. One of the things that business schools around the world have come to realise quite recently is the problem of trying to give the opportunity for people to demonstrate leadership. Firstly, when you're in a distributed organisation, but secondly, when a lot of people are now working from home, it's a sort of double whammy. And a lot of people we're finding, just don't feel empowered to do that. Not my business, not mine, I do my job, that kind of approach. And one of the things that I'd like to suggest is that, if I may, is that when you run the workshops, you look at that sort of opportunity, because once you get people engaged in feeling that they can demonstrate leadership wherever they are in the organisation, then I think what we're finding from the published research is that has a big effect upon their attitude towards the host organisation, a very positive one, because they feel they're included in that, because there's something they're actually doing that they weren't necessarily doing before. So I would just make that suggestion to you, if I may, when you design the workshops with colleagues, that you include consideration of that in what you do. Thank you.
Mark.
Thank you. It really helpful to see this level of detail and transparency. I mean, just an observation in terms of process. It was May, it's now nearly October. I think we need to find a way of allowing the board to see this much quicker, and if that involves putting more pressure on our provider to produce their product quicker, then we need to do that, because the danger is we have lots of conversations about what's been done since and don't focus on the scores, and with such a good proportion of our people spending the time to commit to this process, we need to give them the full respect of seeing the scores without trying to rationalise that the world has changed since. Two things from me. I like Stephen, I was kind of quite struck by the chart on primary reason for continuing to work here. I was not particularly surprised by the elements, but was surprised by the order, which was kind of almost upside down from other organisations that I would have been more familiar with. But one of the things that struck me was the significant gap there between really strong buy-in and drive for our purpose and values, but a very low score for, low on the list is our vision, and is that indicative of opportunities to much better integrate the two to get people more bought into what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. That was one question, and then my second question is about bullying and harassment and discrimination, where we should not be seeing any red on this, and this is at least the second time that I've seen survey scores here which raise questions and concerns around this area. And we've been previously told that we'd be responding and dealing with this differently. So again, what's going to be different in terms of our response there? How are we going to eliminate red from this? Because that's those are incredibly damaging indications of incredibly damaging events for people who deserve better protection.
If I could go first and then hand to Jackie for the second point. So Mark, slide 39, where primary reason for continuing to work here is around work-life balance and flexibility. Second is purpose and values. The explanation as to why vision is so low. So I think this is another example where this has given us headlines, but we don't have the granular depth or the explanation under. So I am using a degree of interpretation that my exec colleagues may want to come in on. I think people believe in what we're about as an organisation, are passionate about us getting out there and regulating so that people get safe health and social care. I think people at different parts of the organisation are in different places when their views about how we are getting from where we are to where we need to be. So I think there's still really good buy-in for our strategy, regulating through the eyes of people with lived experiences, understanding quality and risk within a place. But actually, as Mark said, we're in quite a painful place at the moment where our people are, some of our new changes have switched on, some they're still having to use old systems. And that is one where I am very hopeful that in maybe 9 to 12 months, I'm giving ourselves longer than 6 months because I think next 6 months are still going to be pretty difficult. I really would hope to see that come back out again. But Nadia, that might be one where when we do our workshops, we can try and tease out a bit more. It almost feels like a contradiction. So you believe in our purpose and values, but you're not liking our vision. As I say, I'm interpreting it that some people are finding this change really tough at the moment, even though they still believe in where we're trying to get to. Jackie, I don't know whether you want to say anything about the bullying and harassment.
Yeah. I think with the bullying and harassment, I think we need to take a blended approach and wire everything together in terms of providing safe spaces. So this is not exclusive to, say, managers, speak up, working with the National Guardian's Office, using our staff networks. We have, good communication with trade union colleagues if something's brought by membership to them. And I think it's about how we join that up and make sure that colleagues have as many avenues as we can possibly think of, so that if you feel as though you need to speak to somebody about something you've witnessed or something you're experiencing yourself, you can choose the avenue that best suits you. And I'm not sure, I think we've got the avenues. I don't know if we have done enough to publicise this, make them accessible and make people feel confident in their ability to use whichever one fits their needs and meet them where they are. So I think with staff networks, that's something that we'll need to look at in terms of what else can be done, and probably ask colleagues, and what next? because I think a lot of this, we can have conversations about what we think are the answers, but actually is that hitting the spot? And I think we need to get some endorsement that we are following the right path. And I think this is the same with bullying, harassment. I think we have got plenty avenues, but are they the right ones? And how do we publicise them and make them secure and a safe space?
And if I could just follow up, I mean, you know, one of my concerns is that the scores around did you raise it, and were you satisfied with how it was dealt with? You know, the second scores are bad as well, and the trouble is that very quickly gets into the culture that there is no point in using any of those channels because nothing will happen. So I agree with the response, but I think this is something that needs a huge amount of focus.
Yeah, and just to add, I think as well, this is another one, because if you were to have a look at some of the data that you would normally go to endorse and substantiate that, that's not there. So it's not questioning the validity of this, but again, it's about how you unpick the data that you see in front of you to then do something more about. And I think that's one of the challenges we've got at the moment in terms of some of the backup data.
Yeah, well, although this is our reality, because culture is what it feels like to be here, almost regardless of the of any data that's available.
We will need to close this down soon, but I think a few more hands have got. Chris.
Just to build in some conversations we're having with leaders as part of the transformation, we talked a little bit about what it's like to lead in the organisation at the moment, and I think there's a really interesting sort of link to the purpose of the organisation and the realities of action today. So as we've talked about in other conversations, it's a fast-paced organisation with lots happening, both in terms of transformation, but also in terms of operational delivery. And I think this goes right back to how do we encourage leaders of teams to have good conversations with their people. This started at a conversation about what's the use of email, and actually there's a really interesting point about how do you have good conversations with people that are two-way, because the problem with email, essentially, it's a one-way channel. You don't actually know the intent of an email that's sent, but you can infer intent from a conversation, either face-to-face or indeed even over Teams. But it's about giving people the sense that it is as important to have the right conversation as it is to get the message out. And I think that encouraging the conversations, particularly with frontline leaders, that the time taken to have a conversation is well spent against the other challenges that they have. And indeed, there are many challenges that frontline leaders have. So I think there's something about how we encourage that conversation, because it builds trust. How do you as a leader, choose the right channel for the right type of conversations? And how do you take responsibility not just for having the conversations, but to hearing the feedback and using that feedback back up the line? I think that often in the organisation, there's a layer which the information is communicated in a one-way process, and we don't hear the feedback back up into the executive. So giving leaders not just the power to do that, but the encouragement to have those conversations two-way with their teams, I think will be an important part of our cultural journey that we've talked about earlier.
Thank you. As has been mentioned, these are truly disappointing results and absolutely warrant the very serious interventions that colleagues have already mentioned. I do, however, want to highlight one area of positivity in that our equality networks are the second highest scoring answer under the What We're Doing Well section. I think that's to people that we, as an LGBT plus network, have recently inherited leadership, so we can't take all the credit by any means, but certainly it's to the credit of our other network leaders who have brought it to the point where we're at. We're working really well with Jackie, Nadia and team in regards to the likes of addressing some of the issues around bullying, harassment and discrimination. Ian, I know that we've had some calls with you and Jackie recently, so I'm pleased that that's already started. I do want to share a plea or an offer to our colleagues around the table in that we are here to support you in the work that you're doing locally in addition to the work that Nadia and Jackie are doing. We represent our sub-communities. We provide an awful lot of insight, lived experience and expertise in these areas. So please do use us in what you're doing at all levels within your respective areas. We're more than here to help with that activity.
Thanks, Drew, both for the comment and giving us the positive feedback. More questions. I really have to make it last 2 or 3, otherwise we're going to be hopeless out of time. It's Christine and then Belinda. And then, did you want to speak to that? Okay.
Yes, thanks. I would hope that the amount of time we've given this as a board will reassure people out there that we are genuinely taking this seriously. But I just felt that the pain is now, and most of the actions we're talking about are in the future. So what comfort can we give people that we're listening and things are going to get better now or soon?
Okay.
I mean, I think what the point I was going to make more broadly was that if we look at the surveys over the last few years, the surveys in 2020, 21 during COVID were significantly better than this, despite a very similar working environment. So I think we should, and we can also look at the fact that in those surveys, the results in Mark's group were relatively poor. Results in Mark's group now are very good. And one of the characteristics of this survey is the variability. I think what this survey does who are particularly struggling at the moment with under Tyson's leadership to improve a range of things. And I think what we are seeing is we're starting to see those green shoots of recovery. We're starting to see people with the small ad hoc surveys that we're doing starting to report much more positively about their experiences of change, their experiences of where they see us going, and all of these things. So, I don't think in saying all of that we should be wildly overconfident. But I think 2 things there. One is the speed with which this changes. It went very high, then it went down, and I'm confident that it will come back up again. But there are lots and lots of individual actions which are in place. And I think underpinned by the point you made, which is we are taking this incredibly seriously, that give me confidence that there is a road out of this. We're not there now, and there's things in this survey which we probably haven't necessarily seen in detail in other surveys. Age being one of those things that I think we've not talked about a huge amount in the past, but I think working with the networks on the age dimension of their protected characteristics is important. But I do think there is a potential pathway out of this. But there's lots and lots of individual activities which have been going on for months now and will continue to go on.
Linda.
Just a similar point to Ian, really, that when you break it down to the executive directorate's teams, we've got some really good results in the technology, data and insight, and the regulatory, customer and corporate operations. So I just wanted to stress that, it's not, yes, we've got some, as an overall, there's some very bad results and it's disappointing, but, in some areas, we've really seen good results from the team.
Okay, the RIP we dealt with. Are any questions? It would be impossible to try to summarise all that discussion, so a number of observations, try to put it together, and also one last question for Kate. Firstly, thanks very much for the report, and despite the fact the results are poor, bad, whatever phrase we used, I will give some credit for the fact that as an organisation, I think the fact that we're sharing this not just with the board but with our people and public, the senior executives do deserve credit for that degree of openness. I can think a lot of organisations that wouldn't have done that. So I think that says something about culture, at least, that it does hold everybody to account now to deal with it because we're being so open about it. There are a number of suggestions which perhaps ask you to take away, some really helpful observations, and I think 2 or 3 people commenting on this, Stephen's comment about working from home and just understanding the implications of that, whether it's looking at guidance elsewhere, experience elsewhere through academia or other businesses, and our own experience, that would be extremely helpful. So really well done to all, even if we've got a very poor position. As you said, Christine, I mean, you know, we spent double the amount of time allotted. I think that says something. I hope if any of our colleagues are listening, the board really does want to see this as one of our top three issues to address. So, you know, we've seen observations and comments from James and from Drew about and indeed Mark about the actions of this board. So if there's suggestions or comments along those lines of things we should be doing differently, then please let us know. But I hope the message is getting across that you know, we are throwing what resources are needed this to get it right. Just one last question for you, Kate. One of the things that struck me when I joined this organisation was the number of people commented about the values, and they're clearly quite important to a lot of people. But equally, in my 18 months here, we've never had any discussion about values at the board, and it made me reflect, and to be fair, a couple of other colleagues mentioned it. Most organisations would review or refresh their values every few years, and I'm not sure that's been done for a best part of a decade here. So when I say refreshed, I'm not about changing them. People are heavily committed to a lot of them, but you know, would now be a good time for some sort of relook or refresh at the values, perhaps as part of the culture work, which would come back to the board.
Thank you. And yeah, and as you say, in the results we've just seen, it's the second most important thing for people about why they work here. So values really matters to our people. So very briefly, the last time values were co-produced extensively were 10 years ago, and approximately only a quarter of our people are here who were here when those values were originally established. But that's not to say they don't still have high resonance with people today. So I think as part of the conversation we're going to have around culture, we want to start, and we want to start a conversation with our people, with our networks, with all the other fabulous forums we've got around. Are they still the right values? Do they need a refresh? Do we need to make them more action orientated? Do we want to do something different with them? And I think that needs to be the starting point for the conversation that then says, yep, it's either reconfirming or tweaking or changing the values depending on what the view is in the organisation and obviously around this table. And then what are the associated behaviours, behavioural expectations, and how we hold each other to account for the culture we want to have in the organisation as well. So in the kind of coming weeks or months, we're going to hone down our thinking on that and then have a conversation in November with board and be really keen to hear your thoughts also on it. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed.
But just to reinforce that point, we want to do that very rapidly. We don't want to turn this into a very long period, long thing. That behaviours thing is something we want to do really, really quickly.
Well, I think that's right. As I feedback I get is most people think, yeah, it's good. So doesn't mean it needs rapid change. Kate, Jackie, thank you so much for that. Can we just move on very quickly? We have one last item. We are running badly behind, but let's try and stick to the agenda and take a late break. So we have two documents here you want us to approve, which is the Workforce Race Equality Standard and the Disability Standard, so the reports. Kate, I'll hand to you in a second, but just one observation from me on behalf of NED colleagues, might save some questions. You may have noticed comments in there along the lines of the race or ethnicity status of the non-execs were unknown. You might have found that was a little bit surprising. The same on disability. To clarify why that's there, this data is drawn from our systems. Since non-executives are appointed by the Secretary of State, they hold that data. This organisation doesn't. Apparently with the exception of myself, because I am logged into the system, so my details are in here, yours aren't. I made two suggestions to take into account the approval. This is as of a few months ago, and the composition of the board has changed significantly since then. So I see 0 point in going back and working out what it might have been 6 months ago. But I have asked for the words to be tweaked a little bit just to explain why it is that is the case. We don't hold the data because. And then I'd like to suggest that looking forward, subject of course to the agreement of NEDs who would have to disclose the data, that we do actually capture it internally, so next year we can have reflective of the lot. But to anyone listening, and particularly our colleagues in the organisation, they may have found it very odd that the implication given NEDs weren't prepared to divulge that information. So that deals with that, and so we're being asked to approve it, subject to some tweaks of that wording that I've already agreed. So Kate, over to you.
Thank you. So I'll shortly hand over to Nadia. I think these are two pieces of work we can feel pretty proud of. I think, Nadia, you've benefited hugely, and I've heard you say, from the work you've done on with the networks around this, and obviously two exec colleagues as sponsors of the work. Two things that I want to point out that I think is really positive. I think the honing down in each of the reports around 3 priority areas. As with everything, you could go after so many different things, but I think for both the WRES and WDES to nail down the real clarity around the 3 priority areas they're going to go after, I think should really help us in our ambition of making this deliverable and measurable as well. But without further ado, over to you, Nadia.
Thank you, Kate. There's quite a lot in the plan, so I wanted to draw out some key priorities that are relevant to both plans. Firstly, recruitment. With respect to race, we are focusing on recruitment in terms of improving our representation at exec level and then the internal talent pipeline, so grade A's and B. For disability, this is more focused on the experience in terms of our reasonable adjustments offer. The second priority I'd say that's relevant to both is inclusion. We've discussed a lot about bullying, harassment and discrimination, and we'll be working on that as a priority because it's relevant to both characteristics. And then finally, inclusion from our workplace adjustment support perspective and also our psychological safety and that we're providing to colleagues. That will be a key focus of the inclusion work that we will be doing. We're hoping that the conversations that we start now from September to November on the survey should support that level of growth in psychological safety. Most organisations that welcome feedback, respond to feedback and keep people engaged with feedback show that they are safe to challenge and to speak up to leaders, and people are more engaged with the organisation and they also feel more of a sense of belonging. So we're hoping that some of that work will support the activity that we've got planned within these within both plans. In terms of adjustments with disabilities, there's a massive book of work in terms of improving our reasonable adjustments offer, including the implementation, where I believe we probably have struggled historically. Wider to those adjustments, we're also working on other adjustments and support that people will need, and that will impact both disabled colleagues and colleagues from an ethnic minority background. For example, caring responsibilities, gender identity, their general working styles. So as we've discussed earlier in terms of what works for them working virtually and how we connect with them, hopefully we'll be working to support our staff when it comes to widening our adjustments offer further than what we are offering for disabled colleagues. I'll open the floor for any questions.
Thank you. Questions or comments from colleagues? Tyson?
I just wanted to make a comment from the point of view of being the executive sponsor of the Race Equality Network. First of all, to pay tribute to the REN and particularly their co-chairs, who I think do a fantastic job. I think there are some encouraging signs in the race equality statement. I think particularly around the number of ethnic minority colleagues now in executive grades, although a number of those, particularly in my group, are still in interim positions. But I think that's a start. But I think the two of the big priorities have got to be around recruitment, which is well captured in the plan, because we are very good at attracting interest from people from ethnic minority backgrounds, less good at shortlisting and appointing them. And I think also the data around discrimination in particular is worrying, and I think as part of work stream 3, when we're talking about psychological safety and inclusion, I'd be keen for us also to particularly focus on the work we can do around discrimination. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tyson. Ali, I think, was first, then you, Mark.
Thank you. It's a really clear, helpful report, and I think the clarity of the actions as well as the data is really useful to understand. I agree with what Tyson said about there are some areas that was clearly improvement, but there are also clearly some areas that are striking and really draw a lot of attention to, such as the rates of bullying, harassment and abuse for colleagues with disabilities too. I think similar to the previous report discussed, it'll be helpful to continually analyse the level of data we have to understand actually how do these characteristics intersect with other ones, to understand whether specific nuclei of concerns, or whether they spread more widely within groups of characteristics, and also to keep making sure that as we undertake other pieces of work that impact on this, we're building a more rounded, comprehensive base to understand how we're doing in supporting and valuing our colleagues. Thank you.
Do you want to go first, or you first?
No,
Mark.
No, Mark.
Well, it was just say in a similar vein to Tyson, just a huge thanks to the Disability Equality Network. We've had recently the appointment of 6 new co-chairs, who are all working incredibly hard. The focus around visa adjustments, I think, is critical, and thanks for your support, Jackie and Nadia, on that work. I'm really excited about what that's going to deliver for us, because that's going to make a significant improvement to the experience of colleagues with disabilities at CQC. But the Disability Equality Network are actually working on a huge raft of change and improvements, which I think is exciting in itself, and all supporting the aims of the Workforce Disability Equality Standards.
Thanks. Yeah, one of the things that doesn't come particularly strongly through in terms of the numbers is the work over the last year around support for neurodiverse colleagues. I think one of the things that's what's been quite striking is we have been able to offer direct support for people who need a different computer or a different workspace to work in. But neurodiverse colleagues, I think, have a much more sophisticated set of needs to enable them to contribute. And I think a lot of the work this year has been on deepening our understanding with that group of colleagues. And I think we've made some progress in that area, but I think there's definitely more to go. The BDES doesn't really bring that out super strongly, but I think it is an area that we're very much focused on. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's an area that you feel very strongly about. Any other comments? So we're being asked to approve this. I mean, it's pretty factual, really. So it's helpful to have the interpretation, but as far as the document goes, looks like we're approving that. So thanks very much. Thank you very much, both of you, for spending the time with us this afternoon. Appreciate it. So let's take a well-earned comfort break. For those, apologies to colleagues here and anyone listening in. At this rate, we're running about half an hour behind schedule. We'll see if we can catch some of that up. But otherwise, I hope we're not inconveniencing you too much if we do run over. But let's try and come back in 10 minutes, maybe a little under, if that's at all possible. Thanks very much. Welcome back, everybody. Sorry to rush your tea break. I hope you managed to suitably refresh. I'll try to make up a little bit of time. Let's see how we can do that. The next item on the agenda is the National Complaints Team report. Kate Staples, I think I'll just come straight to you on this, so over to you.
Yeah, Kate's are interchangeable on this one. I'm going to assume you've read the report. A couple of points to highlight for emphasis. First of those, the increase in the number of complaints received during the reporting year, coupled with a vacancy rate in the team, meant that there were more people complaining, but we were slower in responding to their complaints than we would like to be. So our performance has dipped in that regard. In terms of actions we've already taken to respond to that, pleasingly the team is back up at full strength. But what we've also instituted is some monthly case management disciplines to make sure that we are pushing through on responding to complaints in a timely fashion. So hopefully the report for this year will show an improvement again in throughput. Looking ahead to what we can anticipate in complaints year 23-24, as a result of the transformation programme, we are anticipating an uptick in the number of complaints that come through to us. So we are trying to get ahead of that by ensuring that we have connections with colleagues across the organisation on which we can call should complaints come through, specifically around the new transformation and new ways of working. And within my directorate, what we're also looking at is ways in which we can build more resilience in the team to ensure that even if there is more complaints activity in this current complaints year, we are better able to handle it. And in terms of delivering a better outcome, essentially, for those who are complaining, we are constantly trying to improve the way we forge connections and learn from and share insight with colleagues across CQC, so that the complaints exercise is never purely a process or a mechanistic one. We do try to seek the learning from complaints that are upheld and feed that back into the CQC system to make sure that we build on it for future reference. I'll pause there and happily take any questions from colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions? Christine?
Yeah, I note the analysis and also the supplementary paper that was in the reading room that I've had a look at. I wondered if there was any feedback from the people making the complaints about how satisfied they were with the way they were investigated and the outcomes.
It's a mixed picture. Some are satisfied with the service, albeit not necessarily with the answer or the outcome. Some are dissatisfied with both, and in a sense that's to be expected. I think there is an underlying issue to some extent, and I think we've picked up on it in this morning's board about the extent to which there is a mismatch between external stakeholders' expectations as to what we can do and our ability to do what they would like us to do. There tends to be a greater level of dissatisfaction from individual complainants who think we have the power to do something in response to something bad that has happened, and that's not always the case. So there is a mismatch, and we do constantly try and think of ways of correcting that.
Without overcomplicating this, he said, is there any way of pulling out those things that misunderstand scope? Because we do see quite a bit of that. I mean, I see it on the stuff that comes across my desk, and it doesn't mean so there's no learning. Maybe we should be better explaining our scope, but just in terms of understanding performance, clearly there's a big difference between something we're not doing as well as we should have done, but it's in our scope, versus those things that are out of scope. And if anything, it seems to me the outer scope concerns are growing as people have worries about the system and they turn to us to try to fix things.
I mean, one of the interesting things that emerged from a series of one-to-ones I had with colleagues across the directorate was the extent to which human interaction at a very, very early stage could be really helpful in heading off extended correspondence. And that's something I think to bear in mind is making sure that we don't simply rely on electronic means or relatively mechanistic processes, but think about that human interaction, because some of the colleagues, they really are wonderful at giving stakeholders a jolly good listening to, which is really, really important at an early stage. So it's something we'll take your challenge away and see what we can come up with.
Well, the other related point, though, given what you just said, is the PHSO and indeed the previous body I chaired put out some joint guidance on complaints handling. It's really aimed at the NHS a year or so ago, but I don't know if we've looked at it or how our processes compare. But I mean, one of the key things there was that human interaction, showing you got the point at an early stage, makes a huge difference. So if we haven't, perhaps we could make sure we've looked at that.
We've started to do some benchmarking over the last 2 months or so, precisely to understand the extent to which other organisations do things slightly differently from us, and even more importantly, slightly better than us. So those sorts of things will certainly emerge.
Okay, thanks. David.
Thank you, Chair. Kate, I'm not sure whether I may have missed this in the report, so forgive me, but in terms of complaints, do we have a formal "you said, we did, this happened" log? Because other organisations that I serve, we've instituted that so that the complaint, in a sense, although it may well be resolved, the point is that it is also logged in that form. In other words, you said, so we're clear about what you said, this is what we did, and then there's an outcome to that. I don't know, I couldn't see it in the report, but if it's there, point it out to me. If not, perhaps you would consider it.
We certainly seek to respond appropriately to each complainant, to articulate.
Now, this is about forgive me, but this is
Internal.
about our internal learning
yeah.
from the process. I'm quite sure that we
Yeah.
communicate properly with the people who are complaining. That's not my point.
Whether it is in log form, I don't know. I will check, but we certainly do capture the points that are coming out of the complaints and feed them back to colleagues to make sure that there is an opportunity to respond and reflect and adjust behaviours as a consequence. So yes, we do. Whether it's as formal as a log, I will go and check.
Because if I may, the point about it being formal is that it then can't escape the system, if you see what I mean. It's a formal log, and it can be interrogated and looked at, etc. But it's a way in which you can add accountability to the question of complaint handling.
Let me take that one away and we'll feed back.
Thanks, David. Any other comments or questions? No, does not like it. Okay, well, Kate, thank you very much indeed for that. We've now got an interesting session on, it's a policy position that's been put to the board by the management on reducing restrictive practices. Joyce, I think you're going to lead on this, but we're going to be joined by Rebecca Bowes and Jackie Wilson again. She's been in and out like a jack-in-the-box today. I won't say much more until they arrive. Oh, okay. Thank you for joining us. So, Joyce, I'll hand to you in just one second, but just to, this is really just down to hear what's going on and discuss. But it's a policy position the management wish to promote. It's very important. It is in line with our strategy. There's a video which you'll explain in a moment. In terms of output, other than just noting what it is being proposed and discussing, we are proposing that a bit more detail on this will come to the Regulatory Governance Committee of this board at a future meeting. That is the forum in which we consider the way we practically go about handling our regulatory obligations. So we're not being asked to approve anything, but if people want something looked at in more detail, let's capture that, and that can be added to the work of the RGC when they come to look at it. So I just wanted to frame that, what we want to get out of the session. But Joyce, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. That is really helpful in terms of it's really important to raise awareness about our policy positions. When a regulator does a policy position, it's to provide clarity on the stance that we take on certain issues. And in reducing restrictive practices, we've highlighted these issues in two subsequent reports on out of sight, which shows when it's inappropriate in terms of restrictive practices, including restriction, segregation, seclusion, the impact on individuals that this happens to. We've done this policy position largely because people have asked us to do so because of that negative impact and the experiences, and you will see a video later on from somebody with lived experience, Alexis Quinn, who will talk about what has happened to her and why this policy position is so important. I'll hand over to Rebecca and Jackie, who will talk in more detail about the fact that we started this for people as a priority for people with learning disabilities and autism, but actually this position applies to anyone where restrictive practices may impact. So it's any setting and any groups of people where this might have a bearing. So I'll hand over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Joyce. And it's good to be here today at Public Board. Thank you for inviting us. As you already know, my name's Rebecca Bowes. I'm Director for People with Learning Disability and Autistic people. I'm joined by Jackie Wilson here, for one of our policy managers. I wanted to give you a bit of context really to a cross-sector policy position for reducing restrictive practice and why it's so important and how we arrived at this point. Reducing restrictive practice is everybody's responsibility, and we expect everyone in health and social care to be actively working towards reducing restrictive practice to the point where its use is rare and it's considered a failure of care across the system. In its place, we expect to see regularly reviewed, person-centred, trauma-informed care plans that are tailored to each individual's specific needs. It's our contribution to change practice and to reduce restrictive practice. This is a call to action for us all. The policy position does build on the 2020 publication Out of Sight, Who Cares and progress report that we published in 2022. And the progress report showed that too many people with a learning disability and autistic people were still experiencing restrictive practices, including restraint and segregation. We have set 3 ambitions for people with a learning disability and autistic people through our expert advisory group. One of those is about reducing restrictive practice. The other is about health and wellbeing to reduce mortality by better GP access. And the third is around community provision to reduce admission into hospital. These ambitions, alongside our business plan objectives, will direct our work over the next 2 years, and the policy position will set the direction for the sectors and inform our reducing restrictive practices strategy and priorities going forward. Since the publication of our Out of Sight, Who Cares, our work in this area has very much focused on services for people who are autistic or people with a learning disability, as Joyce has already mentioned. However, we know that restrictive practice is used in many sectors and settings we regulate, including acute hospitals, GPs and dentists, patient transport and services for older people. Our expert advisory group told us that this policy is really important because restraint and restrictive practice is a cause of harm and trauma to the person experiencing it. The policy position is developed in response to this request from people with lived experience, and CQC, so this is a cross-sector policy that's applying to all health and social care services that we regulate. We have a full engagement plan to include the notion of a campaign and a call to action for us all, for external stakeholders, and Chris Day, our Director for Engagement, will give some indication of what that will look like a little later on, and after Jackie has given some key headlines around the policy. Internally, our staff will be undertaking specific training promoting the reduction of restrictive practice that's been commissioned through building a reduction restraint network. And helpfully, as Joyce has already mentioned, Alexis Quinn has recorded a short video to share her own experience and to explain to you why this cross-sector policy position is so important for people. So before we go any further, I'm going to hand over to Jackie, who's going to give some key headlines to the policy.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. So to summarise the policy, what's important to know about this? Firstly, we expect services to listen to and understand people and to use this understanding to reduce the need for restrictive practices. So this policy is about prevention where possible. We recognise that organisational culture has a role to play in this. A positive culture will promote trust between people who use the service and staff, and that kind of culture and context is vital in helping people to live their best lives. However, we acknowledge that sometimes restrictive practices are necessary to avoid people harming themselves or other people. But having said this, restrictive practices should never be used to cause pain or as a punishment. So what we're about is tailoring services to people to reduce restrictive practices. In cases where restrictive practices such as restraint or segregation have to be used, we expect providers to analyse and learn from their use and to better tailor care to the individual in future, but also to learn from the incidents and report to the board or equivalent of the organisation. Part of this analysis should include whether there was a failure elsewhere in the system, in the person's pathway leading up to this stage. As an organisation in future, we're going to be looking at ICSs, so it's important we take that big picture and we ask people to carry out that analysis. So importantly, we're asking providers to support people after incidents of restrictive practice, because often people are traumatised and they need some form of therapy or support afterwards. Finally, we highlight that the regulations we will use to enforce this are Regulation 12 and 13, that's safe care and safeguarding, so that there's clarity both for our own staff and for providers in knowing how we will enforce this. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Okay, so before we do play the video, Curtis, thanks for waiting. Chris, did you want to just give a little bit of background in terms of the campaign, please?
Thanks. So, as colleagues have said, this piece of work stems right back to the Out of Sight Who Cares report, which talked for the first time about people's experience of restrictive practice. And what we wanted to try and do with the work now and with the policy position is to offer clarity around what we felt was acceptable for people using services, clarity for what we expect from people delivering care at the front line of care, clarity for commissioners, clarity for providers. So this piece of work is in an effort to create that clarity that has been sought by a variety of colleagues. I just want to pay tribute to the colleagues in the room and colleagues in CQC who've put this piece of work together, and also to Alexis Quinn, who you'll hear about shortly in the video. I think a combination of her testimony to make that change possible, and also our determination to keep this issue alive from the first Out of Sight report I think is really important. So we've already published a blog, but the idea is that we would use that blog and use the information in a statement to have ongoing conversations, particularly with partner organisations who often are instrumental in beginning that change in the wider system, commissioners, and providers, and also people at the front line of care, so they really understand the implications of this and what we're seeking to change as a result of this. We want to encourage a better way of working. We want to encourage a move away from areas of service that we feel are toxic to people's needs. We know that some of this acts in detriment and often can prolong people's use of services. So the video will be played shortly, but I think this will be an ongoing campaign for us as we go into this year. It'll be mentioned in State of Care this year. And our aim is to continue the conversations with DHSC, with NHS England, but also with other organisations that represent commissioners and providers, so that we can really embed this way of thinking into their work.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, I'm going to ask Curtis now to play the video, please, Curtis, and then after there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Alexis Quinn. I'm an autistic person and was previously detained in inpatient settings for 4 years. During that time, restraint was part of my life. I would have a sensory overload, I'd be restrained, I'd be secluded, and then I would wait for that overload to happen again. Not much proactive, trauma-informed care really was going on, and for me I think what was happening is that staff were focusing on risk and management of distress, and in doing so were objectifying parts of me, pathologizing them, and that led really to a response of force. So what's really important about this policy document that the CQC are suggesting and setting out is that it insists on a proactive way of managing and caring, really, actually caring for people in settings. So just if you don't mind, just my indulging you with a little anecdote, but I was being transferred between two secure services in the back of a caged ambulance. I was folded in half to get inside. I was sat on a very sort of narrow plastic bench. There was no seatbelt. My hands were handcuffed together. My legs were tied together with leg straps. I was in there for about 4 hours, and there was surveillance inside the vehicle, and there was no toilet. So when I arrived, I was soiled and quite stinking and understandably very sort of upset and distressed. And the staff opened the doors to the cage. There was 2 staff on one side, 2 staff on the other side. The idea, I guess, was that I was going to kick off or I was going to try and run away, but obviously my legs were tied, but I couldn't go very far. But nevertheless, the 4 staff waiting for me. There was also a nurse from the unit I was being transferred to that I knew very well. And she came up to the vehicle, and I was stood there, as I say, soiled, handcuffed, leg strapped. And she said to the staff, she said, take those handcuffs, those leg straps off Alexis. We were standing outside, and the staff sort of looked at each other and were like, are you for real? And she said, take them off. And you could see the staff were just like really perplexed, like, this woman's dangerous, like, And she said, take them off now. Anyway, the staff took them off reluctantly. And she came up to me and she gave me a big hug. And, I think this is a really important story, because what it does is it shows different perceptions. One member of staff saw the humanity, the other saw the risk. And when we see humanity, we're much more likely to respond with compassion, with kindness, with love. And so I'm really pleased to welcome this policy document from the CQC, because what it does is it makes clear that, like that nurse, everyone has to find the humanity in people. It is not okay just to see risk and just to respond with force. It's not okay to see otherness and difference. Actually, we need to support with compassion. We need to be proactive. And as the statement also says, this requires working in a way which is, proactive. It means not considering restrictive practices as the status quo, as part of the job, but rather something that, is rare. Restrictive practice should be rare. It's a failure to meet a person's needs. Now, after I'd been restrained, I was often expected just to get on with it. But what's really needed is what this policy document does. And it suggests, there has to be reassurance, there has to be compassion, there has to be somebody that helps the person to feel safe again. And so this statement might increase opportunities for post-incident support. And how wonderful if managers, prioritised opportunities for post-incident learning, so that staff could learn from what happened and break those cycles of restraint, seclusion, repeat. And think about, how we can minimise trauma, both for staff and the person. And finally, this policy will send a clear message that we need to work relationally from the moment the person enters a service until they leave. And this policy, I know, would have made a massive difference to me. It would have made a massive difference to the staff supporting me, because what it does is it sets out expectations. And, in setting out at a policy level those expectations, hopefully this can transfer into some kind of practice change. Now, of course, it's not the answer to all of the problems, but for sure it's part of the solution.
So if there's any questions.
Happy to open to questions. Thank you, Ian.
So any questions or observations or things you'd like the RGC to look at? James.
Well, it's not a question. I just wanted to, first of all, I wanted to publicly thank Alexis for her contribution to this whole process and the work she's done nationally at the Building the Right Support Programme Board, actually. She is a force for good, absolutely. And I wanted to, as Alexis said, this is about liberty and it's about dignity. Whilst this process will be about understanding with providers and staff and making sure that we undertake the work that we do in a learning way and in a supportive way, it does mean potentially that we should send a very strong signal to the boards of those organisations or the management teams that it is their responsibility in this policy to review not just their approach but also individually what's happening to people. And I do think that's a strong leadership expectation that we should send, as well as operating the policy in an absolutely fair and supportive way, and recognising that sometimes it's an appropriate use of that kind of restraint, but the rarity that is being suggested on the video needs to become the norm. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Belinda.
So, yes, I agree. Restrictive practice needs to be reduced. That's been in the mental health guide since 2015. NHS England have been doing work on it since 2016, 2018, and loads of projects, and they've seen massive reductions in restrictive practice in areas where they've targeted. I think my concern is that sometimes restrictive practice is necessary, and we don't want to demonise the use of appropriate restrictive practice that should be used rarely and should be thoroughly reviewed when it has been used. So I think a plea for that really is that we need a more balanced approach. And restrictive practice ranges, doesn't it, from locking the door on a dementia unit to restricting people's access to outside space. It's not all about restraint and seclusion, which are the sharper ends of restrictive practice. And I think the plea really is that whatever practice that health and social care staff use, it should always be done with care and compassion. So that's the right way that we're going to get the best care for people. Not about saying we shouldn't do this and we shouldn't do that. All practice should be delivered with care and compassion, which I think is exactly what Alexis said. So it's more of a comment, really.
Yeah, thank you. That's
do you want to
absolutely
respond,
right.
Rebecca, or then David? Quick question.
No,
Right,
go
Rebecca, do you
ahead,
have any response to?
I was just going to say absolutely, Belinda. That's what our policy position is trying to set out, for that balance and to that whole person-centred approach, thinking about people's best interests, and just making sure we're doing the right thing at the right time across the health and social care sector for people to lead their best lives, really. So thanks for that.
David?
I thought that was an excellent film, if I may say so. It really hit the point. Two things, questions for you, really. Are you familiar with Professor Joy Duxbury's work at Manchester Metropolitan on reduction of restraint? Because she's done some really good papers on that. And if you're not, may I recommend that you look at them. And the second thing is Ben Higgins, who is the Chief Executive of something called Restraint Reduction Network. Is that part of?
Absolutely.
Right,
yeah.
good.
He's a colleague of Alexis's.
Yeah, and we've worked closely with him and the Reduction Restraint Network to commission our training for our staff internally. So yes.
That would go quite a long way to answering Belinda's point, I think, which is, they've taken quite a grown-up view about it is necessary at times.
Absolutely.
It's about sorting out when it's necessary and not lurching towards it as a sort of, well, we'll in case something goes wrong, we'll be quite extreme about this. But his work, that network, is informed by Joy Duxbury's work.
Okay,
so
thank
do look at that.
We will do. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
It's
Thank you.
helpful.
Thanks.
Thanks, David. Christine?
Thank you. I mean, I was moved by Alexis's experience as well, and I think she highlights very clearly the sort of extreme end of restrictive practice and restraint. I think one of my concerns is that restrictive practice, particularly for people with dementia in residential care, has become the norm in many situations. Locking doors between floors, locking access to external environments. And if I had my way, you'd have the model of the De Hoogeweg, if anybody's heard of it, in near Amsterdam, where actually people can move freely all around the campus. And that's the ideal, that's what we would love to see. But the reality is that there are a lot of, particularly smaller providers, but sometimes, the high-end providers in social care, where actually doors are locked, and sometimes that's because the premises don't allow for safety. There are stairs that people will fall down or things like that. And I think that locking doors and that restrictive practice was particularly an issue during COVID, where people were having to be isolated for 14 days, and that's very difficult for someone with dementia to be asked or to be forced to stay in their room. So there's a lot of issues. It's complex. And I think there needs to be some balance, although not too much balance, and possibly some work looking at how we can help those who've got the least in the way of resources as providers to recognise that they can change their practice and to do things differently, because I think there will be some catch-up with people for whom the culture is restrictive before they actually recognise that before they're able to implement change. So I just sort of think those are things, I don't quite know what the solution is, but those are things to take into account.
Thanks. Any other questions? I think I did say one of the things would be to consider in the Regulatory Governance Committee, and you'll remember anyway, Christine, so it may be that particular point would be worth picking up when you have the discussion there, because I think what I'm hearing is violent agreement. We need approach violent agreement with generally what you're saying, but just a little bit of concern around the application of this at the margins and making sure there aren't unintended consequences. Yeah, I'll come to you. So if I don't think we need to report back on that particularly, but I think if you could pick it up in the RGC. What would also be helpful at some stages, as I'm sure you'll be reviewing the efficacy of this in practice, and it would just be useful to make sure we are doing that and we understand at the margins whether it's achieved its aims. I think you indicated that it's really a combination of two things. One is providing guidance as to what is good, reminding providers of their obligations, but also that consistency between our approach and their approach. And I think having a document we can hang our hats on that achieves that would be really helpful. Joyce, sorry.
I think you actually covered it because it wasn't about just we do an assessment and then we tell providers what they're doing badly and then sort of come down hard. But we've got a raft of different regulatory levers that we can use. One would be providing guidance. Two would be how do you support improvement in the sector? How do you support learning and understanding? And that's what we intend to do, and that's part of the improvement campaign that Chris was talking about and the work that the policy is delivering. I think what's at the centre of this policy is to make sure that it's person-centred. So even if people can't think, well, how do I do this? How do I cope? If they look at the person in front of them and think, what's right for this person in front of me, and how can we make it work for the person in front of me, and that bringing that humanity and compassion back into care, I think that would go a long way, even though they may not have had the training or the understanding, but just that understanding from that individual perspective.
Sorry, I haven't got my phone up, which is a force of good, very impressive. But thank you for joining us. We I think going to have James White join us, so Nina, if you could bring James in. We have probably set our presenters an impossible task of delivering a lot of insights in a very short space of time. James, welcome. I don't think most of the NEDs on the board will have met James, so I mean he can introduce himself, but just say he is the interim head of market oversight. And apart from the others, I think there's an excellent opportunity for him to meet you and you to meet him. We only allowed 10 minutes for this. James, we're actually always running about half an hour behind, so use the 10 minutes, but if we could ask you not to run over. In his deck, he's given an introductory slide which shows a sort of highlights or key elements of our process. I'm very aware that some of the newer NEDs may not be familiar with that. So you will, if you haven't covered it yet as part of your induction programme, you will in due course. If you've got any more immediate questions on the process we go through, perhaps you take that offline with James. What I'd like James to do is focus on some of the learnings from what we are doing. But James, over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Look, given I've only got 5 minutes, I'll probably jump straight in. In terms of my background, I've been with CQC 5 years, formerly head of before this role. So I'm going to provide some further details with regards to actions available to market oversight when we identify a provider at stage 5 within the 6-stage operating model. When a provider is at stage 5, we've identified significant risk to financial sustainability. So our actions all around trying to de-escalate risk and attempting to further our understanding around likely business failure and likely service cessation, which is really our statutory role. So one of the options available to us, which is in the paper, is we can instruct an independent business review of a provider's business. That would normally be carried out by an external accountant with a restructuring and turnaround background. And that IBR, an independent business review, would really be focused on any aspect of the provider's business which we have serious concerns around. So, for example, if we're concerned around the short-term financial projections and cash flow, the IBR would focus on that and provide feedback and advice to us. Another example would be if the provider was looking at having to refinance its bank borrowings and we had concerns around that, the IBR would also comment on that. A second option available to us when a provider is at stage 5 in the operating model is we can ask the senior management team of the provider to give us a risk mitigation plan. And a risk mitigation plan is really, we're asking senior management to tell us what they're going to do in regards to risks we've identified in relation to the provider's business. So an example would be if the provider's business turnaround is really predicated upon raising additional monies from shareholders. If we're seriously concerned about that, we want to know what their plan B and what their plan C is, should they not be able to raise those monies from those shareholders. So as I said, it's all about mitigating the risks we've identified. I'll now move on to look at the financial performance of the MO providers, which is in the slides for the period to 31st of March 2023. I think my general comment is it continues to be a challenging time for the MO providers during that period. We've seen further compression of EBITDA margins, and EBITDA is probably our best proxy we have for our market oversight providers in terms of profitability. And look, that's really down to probably two key factors interacting. Staffing challenges remain in terms of recruitment and retention has made it difficult for those providers, and the general inflationary environment has also contributed. And in terms of that inflationary environment, probably one of the key drivers there has been that spike in utilities during those winter months. I'll now look at I suppose, the subsectors we look at within the ASC MO providers. Firstly, care homes for older people. It's been pleasing to see staff costs have been moving in the right direction. But unfortunately, those staff savings which providers have been able to make have really been outweighed by, again, those general inflationary environment, and in particular those utilities. In terms of domiciliary home care providers, the continual trend which we've seen over the last 2 years, and it has been decreasing recently, is hours have continued to reduce. And look, that's really a deliberate decision by the management teams of those providers to try and protect their profit margins as best they can. The key driver of their revenue is LA work, and what they've been doing there with that LA work is certainly looking at it contract by contract in terms of profitability, and if they're not satisfied with the profitability, they're taking actions such as refusing additional hours, letting contracts run to the end of their term, or not re-tendering on work. The final subsector is the specialist providers within market oversight providers. Look, it's been pleasing to see agencies declined for the last 2 quarters through to that March quarter, but for some providers it's at some really elevated levels, and the problem that has for specialist providers is that because of the high acuity nature of specialist providers, a lot of that care is one-on-one. So it really does bite into the profit margins when you've got a nurse there delivering one-on-one care, and it can take it from a profitable care provision to a loss-making provision just from the use of that agency use. I'll now move on to the final part of the pack, which was around the outlook for the MO providers. And look, we've had some more recent data since that 31st of March quarter, and we're obviously in constant engagement with our providers. And look, I think I can say it remains a challenging time for our providers. It will remain challenging, but there are some green shoots of recovery there. Occupancy for older people's care homes, as at the 1st of September, is slowly and steadily increasing, and it's reached 86.8%, which is pleasing to see. That's past our estimate of break-even for those care home operators. In terms of staffing and recruitment, again, there seems to be improvement there in terms of providers are telling us their vacancy levels are down, and there's a general improvement in the labour market, but it remains a difficult time to recruit and retain staff. Further to that, agency for certain providers is still moving in the right direction, but as I mentioned earlier, for some providers it's really got quite embedded in their businesses, and I think when agency gets embedded in certain levels in businesses, it's a long, hard fight to reduce that and try and bring that down to levels that the providers want them to reach. And finally, in terms of LA fee uplifts, we've kind of seen broadly a kind of 8 to 10% increase for the 2023-24 financial year. And look, that is a material increase, but it needs to be, given the inflationary environment these providers have been operating in, particularly particularly with the national living wage increasing at, I think, close to 10%. Look, so that's really my summary of that pack. I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions.
Thanks very much indeed, James. And I think we only just instituted the idea of head of market oversight coming to talk to this board. The thing is, I know it's of real concern to government and hugely important part of our work, but also I think it's quite useful just to put out in the public domain some of the learnings. What James has brought out, which perhaps we didn't cover last time, is in addition to the yearly warning bit of the system, if you like, is actually the fact that we go in some of these cases is in itself a contributor to avoiding failure. So we can't ever claim that. We can never talk about examples, but I think there is a real value add from this organisation, this function in that area. Questions from anyone? James, a comment, and then Stephen, question.
Yeah, you anticipate me, Chair. So I just want to echo the point that you make. We're not supposed to be a deterrent, but we are meant to be a beacon, as it were. And I wanted to point out that it's a really important function for local authorities. It's not just a function up to government to give them, as it were, assurance or risk, but local authorities work with us on the potential consequences of if we have to get to a stage 6. So it's really, really critical for working with those people who would end up with the duty to provide the care that results from the failure. So it's really valued, actually, this function of CQCs.
Stephen.
Really helpful, thank you very much indeed. A couple of questions it raises for me. One is kind of extrapolating these trends. Where is this possibly taking us? Because there's been a decline in profitability. I think from some other papers we've seen recently, there's an overall shrinkage in supply, and there are increasing imbalances across the country where providers can keep going if they can access the self-funded market, but it's a lot harder if you're reliant on the local authority funded market because the rates aren't going up. So kind of where do we go with this? We can monitor it, we can watch it, we can alert people, but is there something more we could and should be doing that creates insight for local authorities, for ICSs, for whoever, about the long-term supply trends and the market exit trends that you're seeing?
I think it's the $64 billion question, but James, you want to comment, and Ian may wish to add, because it is something that we do talk to people about.
Yeah, look, I'll certainly have a stab at answering that. I suppose overall, as I said, that the market does remain fragile. Recent government support has helped in terms of the MSIF funding, and we are entering into coming into the winter months, so who knows exactly what that might mean. In terms of that $64 million question, it's probably not really market oversight's place to, I suppose, answer that, other than I note your comment about the self-funder point in terms of, we've certainly seen that in terms of care homes where they've got that greater focus on self-funders. It can assist, but that's certainly duly noted. But as I said, it's probably not really a question I can ask in terms of market oversight statutory function to basically identify financial sustainability concerns for potentially difficult to replace providers.
Yeah. Thanks. I think it's a really good question, Stephen, and it's something we constantly talk about when we're looking at specific providers. I think a couple of things. One is what you're in essence describing is do we want to step into the market management space? Can we be more proactive in managing the market? I think the short answer to that is no, we can't, because we don't really have the legal virus to do it. I guess ultimately it's a responsibility of government, and it is a live conversation we have with government around who is the provider of last resort in the event a large care home group goes bust, or multiple large care home groups go bust. And it's a conversation that James and colleagues have in a very sophisticated way with government, with named providers and talked to banks and so forth. I think the opportunity for us, though, because I think it's always important we think about this in terms of opportunities. The opportunity for us is in our ICS work, because I think, and our local authority work, I think we are building relationships with local authorities and ICS organisations in many and various forms, where I think we can use those relationships to start to have conversations around whether the right amount of money is being paid locally and so on, and whether the right types of service are being delivered. Because I think, we had earlier on in the pack there was the point about increases in volumes in registration applications. Some of that is driven by this, in the sense of providers looking for specialty ways of delivering services, changing their registration in order to find more profitable ways to exist. So being in a position to explain that and then work collaboratively with local authority partners is probably a space we could probably do more in over the course of time. But then in terms of tangibility, provider of last resort type or operator of last resort, as you would see it if it was, say, a railway franchise, then we're not in that position. And I don't think government wants to be in that position either, to be frank. But maybe it is a conversation that needs to be had at some stage. Thank you.
Christine.
I think this links a little bit to the previous topic about restrictive practice, because one of the most dangerous areas that I understand is specialist providers, so autism, severe learning disability, challenging behaviour. And also, I don't quite know how the market oversight works, but it may well be that at national level, a specialist provider like that is doing okay, but that actually in certain areas they're about to hand back a contract. And I heard of one area, I think they're getting a 2.2% fee increase. And then it's really about viability. So you could have just a local area rather than an overall provider about to sort of exit the market, but that they're exiting the market in one area. And because it's specialist and you need the sort of specialist skills, it's more likely that you're going to end up with more restrictive practices and more difficulties. So I just wonder how we deal with that and how we reflect that.
Yeah, look, that's a really good point. And in terms of parameters for entry into market oversight, it has been set up under the regulations so that it captures large national providers, but also regional providers of scale. So it may well be those providers where you're talking about a regional presence, they could well be in market oversight because of those parameters. And in terms of contract handbacks, that's something we have ongoing engagement with providers in market oversight to understand, one, is that occurring? Two, what does that mean around financial sustainability? But it also helps us understand the wider market, and that's something in terms of market oversight. We do act as something, I suppose, almost an honest broker in terms of, we're a bit like a sponge in terms of we get a lot of data and information and engagement with providers, and we do filter that back to wider government so that it informs them in their decision making and understanding of the market. But your point is well made around you could have it at a very local level where that is the sole provider of that specialist service. But as I said, market oversight is really set up with those parameters to catch large regional or large national providers which are potentially difficult to replace.
Sorry, David.
James, some of the comments I get from local authorities or from the integrated care boards is their worry over, in the care market, the highly leveraged large organisations who they fear could just suddenly walk away from it because of purely financial considerations, in a sense beyond the capability of their own management to deal with, because they're highly leveraged. So an instruction might come down, get out of this market, just as it did with Circle in the NHS. Can you look at that or not? Is that out of scope for you?
It is out of scope. We look at market exit if it's due to business failure and essentially service cessation. But if a provider within market oversight, might well be private equity based, decides that it can deploy its capital elsewhere in maybe another sector and get a better economic return, we're not in a position as regulator to stop them exiting the market. And it might well be their business may prosper in the hands of another operator in terms of assets could, you know, go to an operator with maybe a stronger balance sheet, or it could be split up and some assets end up with a not-for-profit, a charitable operator. So, yeah, to answer your question, we're not in the position to stop a provider exiting the market.
Yeah, but can you take account of the fact that we know that some of these organisations are heavily leveraged because, you know, their accounts demonstrate that. Does that allow you to sort of have a word early on about what kind of alternative provision might be around, etc., or is that, do you have to wait for it to be triggered?
Yeah, look, unfortunately, when a provider, whether it's highly leveraged or not, we look at a lot of, I suppose, factors in terms of assessing their financial sustainability, and high leverage would be one of those factors. But in terms of alerting LAs, in terms of their duties under Section 48 of the Care Act to ensure no cessation of care in as a result of business failure, we can only inform them of that when we make a Stage 6 notification. We can't act as, I suppose, as a de facto credit rating agency.
Yeah.
And
James,
provide
that's
our own
fine.
commentary.
You've answered the question. Thanks very much.
I was going to say, I think he can probably explain more to you later, but just to be clear, and James, correct me if you disagree with this, but you know, if there are limits to what we can do when looking at financial structures of groups, but of course, if a group is highly leveraged and that's visible, let's say within the UK, certainly if it's big enough to go onto the scheme, then it is the sort of thing that we do look at. We would probably bring a real struggle to have any sight of a company here that was highly profitable in the UK but could be much more profitable somewhere else in business and just decided to shut down to redeploy the capital. That would be difficult. The more likely scenario is that before you got there, the UK operation or an entity, as a result of being highly leveraged and other things, was starting to look dodgy, in which case, yes, I would think James would be picking it up under market oversight. And I think that is if you look at the examples of where we've had to report things in the past, then it does cover that. So I wouldn't want the message to get out that we're oblivious to high leverage. Where it's visible and available to us, it's looked at and steps can be taken. And James and colleagues, I mean, it's a reasonable sized team. They do go in and talk to people and have a pretty good understanding of the structures, which is why James and his colleagues come from things like insolvency and restructuring backgrounds. But James can explain in more detail when you get to that stage. If there are no other comments, James, look, I'm sorry we didn't give you enough time to really display your wares, but thank you very much, for covering that so succinctly, and also we should thank you for stepping in as the interim head of this area at a very short notice. I mean, it seems to have been seamless from my perspective, so thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you.
Thanks. A few last items. There is one item to approve, which is the 2023 performance summary. I think we're being asked to approve the principle rather than a specific document. So perhaps Kate or Chris, I think we have mentioned this plan before, but if I could ask you to very briefly mention what's being proposed. I might ask Jeremy to comment because this was on the audit committee agenda the other day, and then we'll take any questions, see whether people have any before we agree.
I can cover that, Ian. I'll keep it brief because I'm keen to get a train home tonight.
And I forgot to welcome Stephanie. Well, Stephanie, welcome back.
Steph's also keen to get a train home. I mean, every year we produce an annual report and accounts that will include a summary of our performance for the year in question. That will outline how we've delivered, how we've made progress against our strategy, etc. The challenge we've got is the last 2 financial years, our annual report and accounts has been severely delayed due to issues with local government pension schemes, the auditing of that, which is completely out of our control and is affecting organisations other than us. But it has meant, in the example we've just been through, that it was 15 months after the end of the financial year before we published our annual report and accounts. What we've been keen to do to bridge the gap is to create a standalone document around our performance for the financial year 22-23 that we can publish and detach ourselves from the annual report and accounts, which will obviously be will be published in future in due course. So that's what this summary document is. We would look to publish it onto our website in due course, and offer any comments or questions on that.
Thanks, Chris. Jeremy, do you want to make a couple of words about the role of the ARAC?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first point to note is this is a plan. It wasn't something we're doing accidentally, because we knew that the accounts were going to be late again. And the other point to make is that as we sit at the moment, this is consistent with the draft annual report and accounts, albeit that won't be formally audited and covered until later on. But it is consistent with it, and that we can give that assurance from ARAC that we've gone through the same process as we would have done for the annual accounts.
Okay, so it's a plan we're proposing. I think the reason it comes here is we don't have to do this. So we're taking on a few risks, at least in theory, not least that the document could have numbers in it when we finish the audit change. It's A, probably unlikely that it would, and B, I say the risk is pretty small because this is unaudited. We're not claiming it is. But I think the concept of being able to explain to the world something about our performance and what we're doing 6 or 9 months earlier than audit regulations will allow us to do is personally very sensible. So not subject to audit, but we will do our very best through Jeremy's ARAC to make sure that it is factually accurate. So we have a process for doing that. So this is really more about the principle. If you think that something should be radically different, raise it, but that then increases the risk that we've got a problem when the audited accounts are published later. So are we happy with the broad proposal? Mark?
Just a question. I think it's a very sensible idea given the reality that we face in terms of when the audited accounts will be available. Once the accounts are published, is this going to be sunset and removed? Is it something that's a temporary document that's sort of transient and then disappears, and is or would they both exist in parallel?
That's a good question, Mark. One I hadn't really considered. Chris, you look like you want to come in. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, my view is this would be sunsetted and be replaced by, so you wouldn't have effectively 2 narratives on 1 year. But as Chris said, the fact that it takes 15 months to get the last bit of the account signed off means that this should be a precursor to what will be the full accounts.
And then maybe an S then, which is I think that's a sensible approach, just to sort of say this would be then sunset, replaced by an audited accounts. The only thing I think we need to plan for is if there were a delta, at what threshold do we need to publish any kind of explanation of the delta that existed between a previous document that was in the public domain and a future document? So just understanding what the sort of tolerance is.
I think it's difficult to pre-agree a threshold because we're saying the probability is that there won't be differences. But it's a good question. We need to think about it, but I think it's difficult to make decisions now. I mean, there is one bit of logic of leaving it out there as a parallel document, which is that most people, with due respect to the accountants in the room, which I suppose my heritage is one, but most people don't get beyond the performance report when they're reading the document. So there is actually some logic in having a separate performance report and then leaving the other 100 pages for those who are interested and understand government accounting. I apologise if I've in any way offended you, Jeremy, but you wanted to comment.
No, I think it is just worth making the point that the performance report, even in the annual accounts, is not formally audited in that sense, but it is checked to make sure that it is consistent with the accounts. So I guess if we did have some sort of inconsistency that we found, then I think we would need to explain that in some way, either in the accounts or as an addendum to the document. I'm not in favour of sunsetting reports because you can't take them away. They're out there, aren't they? People don't undownload them, do they? But, so we have to, in some sense, we have to explain and be transparent is probably the right approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we did this last year was we wrote the annual report and account. It took a long time to be finished off, and then we just did a refresh of the forward and the summary because we realised that it was dated because it was from the COVID period. So did it really make sense in the context? So there was almost a check step before final publication, and I suspect we'll do some version of that this time around.
Okay, so I think we're proving the principle, and at some stage when we have reports back on progress of the ARA, we can readdress and consider what we're doing here. Thank you very much indeed, Chris, and for your input, Jeremy. Board effectiveness review was down for me for an oral report. To note, this is very quick. All I would say to colleagues, just for confirmation, is we did a board effectiveness review, very limited in scope this year in the sense it was purely internal. There weren't that many recommendations coming out of it. I sat down with Sasha. We either have addressed or are in the process of addressing the things in there, some which you've seen. The only other bit I would flag is that combining also with the results of a sort of review of the skill set of the board, there will probably be some training programs or development programs for the board as a whole, with a particular focus on the LEDs, to the extent that the executive may have seen some of this earlier. But the timing of that will depend on the speed at which we can get the final appointment of the board. We are still recruiting for a new full-time AREC chair or permanent AREC chair to replace Jeremy. So I'll take a view on when is a good time to run it. Ideally, I'd like to wait till we have a full board, but we can't wait forever. And we're in the hands of government for that. The minutes of the board meeting were circulated in advance. I don't think we got any comments, so are we happy to take those as approved? Thank you very much. The action log's only got one item on it. It's shown as green because it's due in November, so that's fine. Any other business from anybody before I close the meeting? Okay, well, look, we'll close the meeting at that stage. Apologies to those of you listening in who may be an inconvenience, and apologies my colleagues are running over, but it was such an important topic we discussed earlier on people. I think that had to be the right thing to do. So thank you very much for bearing with us. I'll close the formal bit of the meeting down, but as usual, we do have one or two questions from the public that we have said we will take. There's actually 4 today. The first is actually rather an unusual one. I mean, it's from a commercial organisation who clearly wants to do more business with the health and care system, but it was asked, so I think it's only right we should give an answer. Chris, I think you're going to deal with this. So from a Claire Giancidis, who's the Chief Product Development Officer of Tendable, and the question was, what is the correct channel for a software provider working with the NHS organisations to monitor and improve quality of care to engage in the ongoing CQC transformation programme?
So I think the answer to the question, we engage many commercial enterprises who have innovative solutions for both the health and the care sector, and we regularly work with them. In fact, we recently published an article which focused on a number of areas of innovation. So we're always interested to hear innovation that comes from organisations in different areas, and we're usually used to forming an idea about what we think about that, and sometimes using those as case studies. So you'll see, for example, in State of Care, which will come out in a couple of weeks, there's a few examples of innovation that we've seen both in technology and also in terms of how services are delivered that we'll use. So if you've got good insight, I think my email address is certainly available through the board and other colleagues. We're always interested in good ideas around case studies. What we're really interested in as well is how it's adopted in an area. So good idea with an idea about how it's been adopted in one or another or a number of organisations. But we're really keen, so please get in touch.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. And then we have 3 from Mr. Robin Pike. Nicola, I think in Sean's absence, you're taking the first, which was, how does the CQC regulate the performance of hospitals in their management of 2-week cancel referrals?
Thank you, Ian. So the first thing I would say is that NHS England monitor the performance of hospitals in regards to the 2-week wait standard. Inspectors and inspection teams do review the whole suite of cancer waiting time standards alongside other metrics as part of ongoing monitoring of providers, and that informs both our engagement approach but also does inform inspection. Within our inspection framework, we do have specific prompts around timely access to diagnosis and access to care. And of course, if particular issues or concerns are identified, we would be raising and following that up with providers, with ICBs, and of course with NHS England partners as appropriate. Thank you.
this picks up a really important point about the relationship between organisations and people's experience of care through a pathway. So we have a number of ways in which we do that. Probably the most obvious is through the use of give feedback on care. When people describe their care journey to us, they don't talk about individual organisations. They often talk about the relationship between primary care or adult social care and secondary care. So we get a lot of information through that route, and that helps inform our view. Secondly, we'll work with local partners. So they may be groups that represent people locally, or they may be organisations that are part of a delivery in an area. And we'll use both to form a view of how discharge arrangements, how referrals, how transitions between different groups are working. And we've used it in the past to form a view of good practice between primary care and secondary care in particular, and also where we need to see change and improvement. And I think this will be helpful not only for our regulation of providers, but also for our regulation of ICSs moving forward.
Okay, thanks very much. And then the third and last question: how will the CQC regulate the performance of ICSs in respect to their engagement with the public and patients?
Again, a really important point and a really important question. As I think we described earlier in the conversation, we're currently testing our approach to both ICS and local authority assessments. Part of that assessments will be most, in fact, all ICSs and all local authorities have a view about how they intend to engage, or how they do engage people who use services in their area. And I guess part of our approach is looking at what's the theory and practice of that in an area, and how do people who work in that, who work for people that represent people using services, how do they feel about that engagement that they're having? We're setting out under a number of different areas of our work to look at the relativity of that in different areas. So what's working well, where are local authorities or ICSs challenged, and we want to use an understanding of that to really guide both ICSs and local authorities in terms of what good practice looks like. But critically, for me, the work of an ICS and the work of local authority in this area starts with their understanding of people in their area. We've said in other places that ICSs in LA start in different places, but understanding where people who use their services start is the start point to how they address the issues in their area.
Okay, very comprehensive answer. Thanks very much indeed, Chris. So that also deals with all of the questions from the public. So for those listening in, thank you for bearing with us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next meeting in November.